to the reading and confirmation of the minutes. Thank you for making yourselves available, and look forward to a fruitful discussion, and we can make progress. I believe everyone has a copy of the matrix of submissions from the various groups that will come in handy as we go through the clause by clause. But before that, we have the minutes of meetings at November 24th, December 8th, and December 18th, which are before us. The minutes are, quite lengthy. I don't know if we have any, if we could start with the meeting of November 24th, if there are any sort of amendments that anyone would like to move with respect to these.
Chairman, just before you get to the minutes, have you received any communication about a new member of the committee? Because I believe the Senate resolutions move in the Senate for Senator Dr. Andre Orton to replace Damien Crawford on the committee, and I just wonder if you got that information. I expect Dr. Orton to join us today.
Okay, I haven't received that yet.
To avoid an embarrassment when Dr. Orton comes, can we just make the necessary check? Because I think you would recall, Kawan would recall the resolution being moved and approved in the Senate.
Okay, the minutes of November 24th are before us. I don't propose to go page by page, since we have about 30 pages of minutes among the three meetings. But if we could just pass the minutes, can we have a motion for the minutes of November 24th to accept?
I so move, Chair.
Seconded. All in favor? Everybody quiet today. Yeah.
So the truth is, we're approving minutes I'm not sure everybody have read. But so that's
if there's an egregious error, that I have no problem recommitting it at a later stage. Yeah.
I think that would be best.
And same applies to December 8th and December 18th. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Matters arising from the minutes. On my read through them, there's no matter arising for this meeting. At the last meeting, we proposed to have the matrix submitted to be used for the clause by clause section. Are there any comments on the matrix itself?
You mean comments separate from going through it?
Just procedurally, I'm asking. If any comments separate from going by? It's on the agenda item as matrix, but I don't think.
Yeah. Well, one issue. I don't know if this is the appropriate time to bring it up or not, but it is to do with the actual. It's a general recommendation issue. The whole question of the basket of goods that is used to compile the inflation statistics for the country and the frequency with which the basket is updated. With the BOJ Act being amended to give primacy to inflation targeting, clearly what the inflation rate is and its currency accuracy, currency as in time, I mean, is important. And the point has been made that the current basket, for example, is a little dated now. Certain things that consumers or are consumed a lot in Jamaica are not part of the basket currently. And it seems to me that we ought to consider requiring, maybe as a consequential amendment to the act that governs statting, a regular updating of the basket every 3 years or something like that. Because I don't know if it's the last revision was done over 10 years ago, I think. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that are not on it that are now have become in vogue over time. So that was a thought that I wanted to share with you.
Chairman, in addition to that, I believe that during our deliberations on that specific matter, there was also a recommendation that in making the determination there will be consultation, especially with the trade unions who represent workers who would have been impacted. And if I can recall, I believe the governor somehow did support that recommendation. I'm looking for it if it was recorded in the matrix, but I remember the discussion. It might have been in the minutes, right?
So the basket is updated on a regular on a periodic basis, and there's an update that is underway now, and it is consistent with the consumption survey that the PIOJ conducts. So they have a consumption survey that determines how people consume, and then the basket is updated. What I propose to do at the next meeting is to provide you a proper update on where we are with respect to that, so we can make an informed decision. My understanding from discussions I've had with Statin and with PIOJ is that in the context of 400 items in the basket, the change is not that fundamental, in that the 400 items we still primarily consume. There'll be new things like phone cards, for example, which were not a big consumption item when it was last updated, and one or two things with the digital economy, nail extensions and hair and
wigs, which are consumed a lot.
Yeah.
Toll rates. I don't know.
There'll be things like that. Yeah. So what I propose to do is come with a full update at the next meeting as to where we are with the update in the basket,
and how long when it was,
and how long it's going to take, and when it was the last one,
right,
and what the procedure is going forward. Yeah.
Because someone said the last revision was in 2007. Someone else said 2005. I don't even know.
It's about 2007, 2008.
Yeah. So that's good long time ago.
Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Come on.
Okay, so moving on to the clause by clause, we start with the
wait, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, I'm not sure. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry,
go right ahead. Mr. Chairman, just for us to get an idea of what is proposed in terms of the sitting of the committee. We had started these meetings in November of last year, and at that time there seemed to have been some urgency to it. And we were asked to meet on Saturdays and Sundays, and were taken out of Parliament to finish this. And then as of December, we just suspended meetings for 4 months. Now we're back meeting again, but I just need some clarity. What has changed that allowed us to have such great urgency at the start, and then for it to suspend? And secondly, what are we what's the plan? We have a matrix here. We have the act, clause by clause, and how are we going to address that? So that would be the first concern.
Thank you for the question, member. In conversations I've had with the leader of opposition, who is the former Minister of Finance, I was just always of the view that this was a bill that we could get done within a specific period of time, meaning a specific number of meetings. It's not a complicated bill. And there would have been a lot of advantage to have concluded the Joint Select Committee meetings several months ago. And what I was attempting to do in November and December last year was to do that, and so meetings in November, meetings in December, and possibly early January, and to get the Joint Select Committee process completed. You'll recall that there was some concern about the Saturday meetings, which, even though we had, I believe, 2, and so I stopped the Saturday meetings. And then, you'll recall, Member Bunting had an objection to meeting until, conflated it's not, brought the issue of Petrojam into the JSC. I just sought to avoid all of that, tension. And therefore we didn't meet in January, and then I got into the budget season. And once we're into the budget cycle, February is consumed by the budget preparations. March is consumed by the budget debate. And hence, we are where we are. Going forward, I'm hoping we have booked 3 consecutive meetings, 3 Wednesdays at 2 o'clock, this Wednesday, next Wednesday, and the following. And I'm hoping that we can make substantial progress over the course of those meetings. And it is possible that we could actually conclude the clause by clause during that period, depending on the nature of our discussions. At the end of those sort of 3 meetings, we take stock and see where we go from there. But there's a lot of advantage, member, to getting this done in good time. You will recall that the current governor demits office shortly, and there's an independent search for a successor. And recruiting a successor with uncertainty about what the regime is going to be is very difficult. So I would seek the cooperation of the committee that even if we don't have a bill that's passed Parliament, there is a bill that can, is going to go to the House, not for September when he leaves, but before we, the selection process is complete. Whoever would succeed Governor Winter is going to need to give, assuming that person is employed in some capacity, will need time for notice, time for handover, and so forth. So I would really seek the cooperation of the committee just to bear in mind some of those sort of national impact of the timeline. So I hope I provided you with a response to your question.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I say that because based on the first meeting of the committee, I was under the impression that there was some almost structural benchmark that we had to meet with the BOJ Act, why we were rushing it in the way. I mean, we were asked to meet on Saturdays and Sundays initially. Members of the committee had indicated the difficulties with that, especially at the time of year where we had other things, and we were sort of impressed as to the urgency. So you can understand, certainly my concern, I don't know about other members, that despite everything, we have gone the whole of January, February, March, April without a meeting, despite the urgency. And quite frankly, I think we have shown, or certainly gone out of our way to meet. It's just that no meetings have been called in the last 4 months. That's the first thing. Second, I think it would be good if we had some more specific timelines. You mentioned the issue of the governor. I'm not certain of the exact date and the fact that you're going to need a bill. Is that date imminent? Is it 3 months, 6 months?
Yeah, so just to respond to the first part of your question, which is, repeat of what you said earlier, I'm just reminding you that in the last meeting we had, Member Bunting walked out in protest that he didn't see why this committee was meeting and the AC,
which met in January,
right? And therefore, for peaceful life, we didn't. The only time that the meetings would have been possible in January for the committee, given my schedule in terms of budget preparations, would have been early January, meaning the first 2 weeks of January or first 3 weeks. Thereafter, I think you will know from your experience that the process is incredibly intense and very detailed. In addition to that, there's a review, IMF review in the February, and it was all something that I always knew, and that's why I was trying to get as far as we could before that process started, because I knew that it would take several months before my schedule, just speaking as in my capacity, would have allowed for the select committee meetings. With respect to the timeline, the timeline that I am working with is September of this year.
The timeline of what? I'm not quite certain what that means.
No, let me rephrase that. The governor's contract expires in November of this year. We appointed a selection committee to find a suitable successor.
Oh, you have appointed
in
one
January of this year.
Yes.
And that selection committee has been working since then. They have posted a number of advertisements in local and international press, and that process continues. As you can understand, a new or someone who succeeds Governor Winter, be reasonable for them to want to have a good idea of the regime that they will operate in. And therefore, it would be just useful if we could conclude the joint select committee process. So even if the bill isn't passed and there are future amendments that might come in the Parliament and in the Senate, at least there is a uniformity in this committee which is representative of what that framework is going to look like. And if we can make substantial progress over the next 3 meetings in May, and let's leave room open for one other meeting to kind of wrap up and close, then I think that would serve that purpose. Because if you work backwards, an identified candidate, would probably want to have at least 3 months or thereabouts, and then you'd want to have, or I would want to have a period of overlap to just ensure that the succession is smooth. And so I would just seek your cooperation in that regard.
Well, it depends on your agenda largely. But I will say this though. I had indicated at a previous meeting, and I think we are going to do the clause by clause, which is why I asked how you determined to proceed, that the regulations that will govern the appointment of the new governor, that there were some concerns that I had with it in terms of, and just generally speaking, while we had discussed the length of the period of appointment and indicated that it would be, because of the length of it, it spans a period of time. While looking at the independence, I believe that there is no reason why we should not find someone who can be agreed upon in a general sense by both the government and the opposition, whether it is in the shortlisting or the final selection, that I thought that we had to look at some of these things, and we had the discussion, and I don't think that we have had.
So as we go through the clause by clause, we will have an opportunity to have some of these discussions.
Right,
in a more focused way.
Exactly, but I make that point the basis that in doing a selection process, someone applying for the job would really want to know the framework within which he's going to operate. So I think that given the timelines you have given, you have already started that process.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you have, I suggest that you fast track elements. In other words, looking at the bill as it pertains to the governor, and look at those things early, or ensure that it's early, so at least you have a general idea. Whether we agree to what is here or there are minor amendments or otherwise, I do believe that we need to put that.
But there's every chance that the successor to the incumbent governor will not be appointed under this new legislation. That's possible, isn't it? It depends on the timing of things.
It's possible. It depends on how, that was my original desire, member. That's what I wanted to do, and that's why I was trying to kind of move with alacrity. It's still possible depending on how we work together.
It is possible. Yeah. It is possible. But if the act is passed and in effect before the new appointment takes place, and the new appointment has to conform to the new act. If it's not in effect, then it's governed by the existing act. And there would presumably have to be some transitional thing in there for that, in the new one for that arrangement.
So with that as a background, can we do I have your agreement to just begin, propose to go through clause by clause, and we discuss as they come up?
As concerned, Chairman, if we went,
So we got we just want to welcome the new member to the committee, Senator Andre Horton, and thank you for making it. Welcome. Senator Brown?
Yeah. The agenda has the matrix first at 7, and then clause by clause review. I understand clause by clause we're going through the bill, but that need to be informed by the matrix.
Yes, so at each clause, we can refer to the matrix. We can be reminded of what various entities or individuals had to say, and we can have a discussion that takes into consideration those views.
Well, for example, on page 1 of the matrix, there are general observations, all right? And then the matrix goes through sequentially. Maybe we could just look at page 1 of the matrix, see if there's any decision to be taken on that or not, and then...
Proposing to go we have the bill and the matrix side by side. We go, clause, so the title, there's nothing in the matrix on that.
I'm just saying, because there's a page of the matrix that doesn't refer to any specific clauses, I just thought we could just quickly digest page 1 and sort that out.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and then
all right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, before we dive into the weeds, first of all, let me apologize for being late today. And I assure you that given the resolution of the issues that that we had found contentious, or the conflation of them. And given that those are behind us, I anticipate a much smoother and more collegial environment in the committee. With the passage of time, however, some other issues which we will deal with when we come to the clause by clause, or which will come up in a clause by clause. But I'm reminded of at one of the very early meetings, and perhaps this might be useful, particularly since we have a new member, where we had said we wanted a sort of philosophical overview of the schema that we contemplated. And we discussed a few aspects of it, the inflation targeting and so on, but less so in terms of the philosophy guiding the governance structure. We spoke of independence, which is something I am increasingly skeptical of. And when I say skeptical, this doesn't refer to operational independence, but governance. There must be oversight. As we have been seeing in the PAC and elsewhere, parliamentary oversight is critical. And I've become more and more wary of creating commissions and creating offices that are independent, and which is fine when you have the right personnel, but every now and then a row gets, appointed as a general manager, a chairman, and then or a minister, and then we see that some serious damage can be done. So given even that experience of the last year or so, I really want to look at this much more carefully, because as much money as Petrojam and those places might have had, they are pale in significance to Bank of Jamaica and the potential damage that could be done by having a wrong candidate, or a wrong governor, or a wrong deputy governor. So even before we dive into the weeds, so to speak, of the clause by clause and everything, I think it might be just useful to recap. I mean, it's been 5 months since we were last meeting. Just that sort of philosophical overview of the scheme of arrangement that we're trying to institute, with all the specific details here, but with a particular eye to not just the singular purpose or the primary principal purpose that you had elaborated on in the earlier meetings, but more so on the governance structure, and not just in terms of sort of the mechanics of it, the length of time and the appointment, but where I want to look again particularly at the parliamentary oversight, because even in the countries that have the most independent systems do have fairly rigorous oversight by the legislature. And I think it might be just useful, if you don't mind, to just recap that framework. And I think it might be particularly useful, not for me as a reminder, but also for Dr. Horton, who may not have been I'm not sure how closely he was following the earlier meetings that we had last year.
Thanks, Member Bunting. You'll recall that a similar point was made at the very first meeting, and I think in a subsequent meeting, I can't remember if it was the second or the third, I think it might have been the third, I'm not sure which one. The BOJ presented a document that had the entire overview. It was in the first meeting or second. I can't remember which one. But just responding to your to the suggestion you're making, which I accept. If we have a risk of a rogue, the risk is under the current framework, because under the current framework, the governor is responsible for everything, and power is concentrated in the person of the governor. We've been fortunate to have good individuals in that role that haven't abused that. But today, the decision making for some of the central monetary policy responsibilities of the central bank, the governor in his or her shower can make decisions that affect us all. Under the new arrangement, we're moving towards, let me call it sort of a three systems or three-tier accountability. The first is to strengthen the board itself and strengthen the board in relation to the governor. As you know, if you were to take a private sector example, private sector firm that you were associated with before you came into politics, for example, if you had a board that changed wholesale change every 4 years, the person in the CEO's seat or in the chair's seat could, if they just dominate, because there wouldn't be enough time for the institutional knowledge to accumulate and to be transferred. So one of the things that we want to do is to stagger board appointments to balance the power of knowledge, of institutional knowledge, between the governor and the board, so that there is never a time that you have a wholesale or whole scale, whatever the word, change of the board. The second component of that balance is in the tenure of board members as well, and we can discuss what's appropriate, but longer than it is today. So longer than it is today and staggered to ensure that we never have everybody leaving at the same time. The third element of the kind of board structure, which I say that the first tier, is to devolve certain decisions to committees of the board as opposed to the governor. The Monetary Policy Committee being a very important one, the committee that makes decisions on interest rates and on cash reserve ratios and just monetary policy decisions, liquidity transactions and so forth. We want to institute in the law that a monetary policy committee must exist and have these functions. The governor chairs the Monetary Policy Committee, but not only does it have board members, but it has members from outside of the BOJ structure. So the Monetary Policy Committee has executives, it has non-executive board members, and then we would bring people from outside. Could be international, one could be international, one could be local, to bring a broader perspective to these decisions. Today, we don't have that. Today, there's nothing in the legislation that stops a governor from making those decisions, him or herself. So we're strengthening committees, we're strengthening the board and balancing the power between the governor and the board. And then Parliament...
Just clarification, and those members will not be executives. Those will not be... all the members of the Monetary Policy Committees will not be executives.
Correct. There will be some executives. I think it's it might have been 3 executives or 2. It's in the bill, but a few executives, and then majority executives, and then we'll have persons who are from outside of the BOJ structure. They're not on the board. They're not on the monetary. They're not on the board. They're not employees of the BOJ, but they're from outside. And that allows a great deal of flexibility. In one of our 3 meetings to date, someone had suggested that one of those persons should be international, for example. I, for one, don't think we should codify that. But I share that view that there is space that we could have a Jamaican who's expert in this area who doesn't necessarily reside here, who can bring a perspective. But by broadening the decision-making responsibilities of other people other than the governor, we strengthen the governance framework. And then, to me, the most important feature, and it alludes to the point that you're ultimately making, is that the BOJ becomes accountable not to the minister, as is the case today. So accountability is not something that we're taking away. We're pivoting accountability away from solely the minister to the parliament. So under the legislation, the BOJ would be required, the governor and his or her team would be required to appear before parliament at least twice a year or any other time that parliament deems fit to explain decisions, to explain what is happening in the marketplace, and in demonstration of the fact that the Bank of Jamaica exists to serve the people of Jamaica. Now, one of the things that we have to discuss is how does that take place? And I think the preliminary discussions that we have had is that the governor would appear before meaning the entire sort of parliament. We'd have to have rules about, I don't know, you can't stand up and talk for 30 minutes in that setting, but you want everybody, your constituents from Westmoreland, constituents from St. Thomas, from wherever, Manchester, to be able to direct the questions that your constituents have to the governor and have the governor answer in public. And that, would be delivering an accountability structure that is necessary for the economic arrangements that we have. I should mention, in addition, another layer of accountability is that those monetary policy committee meetings, the legislation will call for a report to be published that day on the key decisions, and then for the minutes of the meeting to be published at a certain time after, so that everyone will understand what are the things that right now we don't know. Right now it's just a black box. People don't know how these decisions are influenced. You'll see the minutes, what various members of the committee are concerned about, the things they look at, how far into the future they're considering, what are the disagreements among them. And in a market economy which we have, information is the most important ingredient. And what this attempts to do is to bring a lot more information into the public domain, which allows for a higher level of accountability.
We're grappling with the same objective with PetroJam and its fuel pricing committee at the PAC. So this is very much consistent with what we are now. Well, we, speaking on behalf of the chairman, we've been trying to get PetroJam to appreciate that, to have three internal people sit down and decide week to week to set administratively, albeit guided by a formula that only they know what it is, but set administratively a price that affects so many things in the economy, probably second only to interest rates or exchange rates. But what you've up to now focused on is sort of the technical work and the reporting and the transparency around the technical work. But just shift a little bit and also look at the sort of more broader administrative oversight. One of the things that in many corporations or many organizational theorists say that, for example, the chairman and CEO positions should be separated, so you get better oversight by a board. That is not a tradition in central banks.
That's actually mandated in the corporate governance framework for the public sector now.
Right, but I think the Bank of Jamaica is an exception because it has its own statute, and I think there's Port Authority is another exception. And there are a few there are a few exceptions, but when they reside in one person, then it's even more important to have an external check, audit. And, you know, I remember some discussion, and I just want you to just recap this for me, in terms of the financial management accountability, what's the name of that law?
The FAA, Financial Administration Audit Act.
Financial Administration and Audit Act, and the public, we're not, there's a clutch of PBMA, etc. Will these apply to BOG, or will there be some parallel, or are they subject to the same opportunities and restrictions and constraints? Same opportunities for audit by the Auditor General, for example, and restrictions that the general public sector would be under that legislation. And for example, so would they, if our audit is done, would they come to PAC? And I'm not talking about the technical, the monetary policy or the supervisory. I'm talking about the procurement, for example, or if there are allegations of nepotism and HR malpractices and whatever it could be, they must have the same accountability to Parliament. Or I'm asking you to confirm that they will have the same accountability to Parliament as any other public sector body.
Okay, I mean, the good news first is that the experience over several decades has shown that the BOJ, under good times and bad times, even though, no, okay, let me not go into the history. So let's looking forward. I mean, we are into the clause by clause with this kind of question. The bill proposes that the BOJ be accepted from the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, but proposes that the relevant statutes in the Public Bodies and Management and Accountability Act be lifted and put into regulation, deal with it more in the clause by clause. So the proposal is all of the relevant, and we have a list of the things that are more than relevant, you know, procurement and so forth, would lift those out of the PBMA and have specific regulations for the BOJ, where in a number of instances it mirrors what's in the PBMA, but in areas where there is conflict it doesn't. And there are specific examples that we can share. And the PBMA is updated a lot of the time in response to things like Petrodam, in response to other. And what has happened over time is that those, when you have this one size fits all, you have updates that lead to contradictions because it's applying to everything, including the BOJ. So I'm answering you to say we'll go even tighter to have regulations that are specific to the BOJ. And I would give, you know, an undertaking that we wouldn't be seeking to while we will need to come out of the committee before regulations, but we wouldn't seek to pass the law before the regulations are ready or tabled.
But
yes.
There are some, I take the point.
This is now in the detail of clause by clause.
You're giving us an undertaking that this bill will not be passed before the regulations are ready, or is it operational?
If I may,
no,
Chair.
before the, no, let me rephrase that. Before the appointed day. That is what I meant. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Just want to, just for the,
you won't bring it into effect. You won't bring it in these amendments into effect until there are the accompanying regulations.
Correct. But we would discuss in great detail what those regulations ought to include. And in the clause by clause, in response to some of the comments here, I think the BOJ is prepared to discuss what those regulations ought to include, and procurement is big among them.
Well, as you know, in the little memo I did, I expressed grave reservations about the wholesale or whole-scale exclusion of the PBMA from any application to the BOJ. I can understand that it may not apply in its entirety, or even in substantial parts of it may not apply, but there are some fundamental things in it that I think should apply, especially in relation to the accountability surveillance of the Auditor General's jurisdiction I think that's really important. I would not want to see that excluded. And I identified in an appendix to my memo some of the things which I thought were worth considering, which I thought were important. So when we get to the clause by clause, I guess we can have a look at that. One issue, I don't know if you finished your overview or of the Act.
Chair, could I comment on just that last very quickly, if I may, just because I think one of the things that we'll find as we look at it is that in many ways Bank of Jamaica Act was had many of the elements that the PBMA, which came later, adopted things. So one of the conflict areas is not that they're necessarily in direct conflict. Sometimes, as an example, Bank of Jamaica has to deliver its annual report within 3 months. PBMA is 4 months. There are tighter standards, or things like the Auditor General's, the ability for the Auditor General to come in, that's already in the BOJ Act, and it preceded the PBMA. So reconciling all of these things is important to make sure the highest standard, as the chairman mentioned, applies to the Bank of Jamaica on those sort of accountability issues, but also to make sure that you don't inadvertently, as has happened with the legislation of the PBMA in the past, pass something that applies to everybody, but by creating, it can create a contradiction or conflict with what the Bank of Jamaica has to do that then requires an amendment of the PBMA to reverse it. And in the time between the initial passage or the initial law and when we change it, you have a financial market that may be impacted inadvertently. So it's really to try to make sure that in importing all those fundamental elements of the PBMA, that they're put specifically for BOJ so that Parliament, everybody can make sure that those sort of things don't happen, and to also make sure that that highest standard of accountability that the Bank of Jamaica has been proud to seek to observe throughout its history, it is always at the highest level in terms of accountability.
One fundamental area of departure, however, seems to be terms and conditions of employment, including salary, that I know prescribed by the Ministry of Finance. That, as I understand the legislation, it is to free the Bank of Jamaica to set its own terms and conditions, independent. I know that's what you want, independent of the ministry, and I can understand my brother Cavan, Gaila Green. I recall you didn't want to go to history, Mr. Chairman, but I recall that it was in a bank owned by the government that the term fat cats salary scandal emerged. And given the inequality in the society, we have to be very careful. While I want the people to get more, it's kind of difficult for the UTech teachers to be saying, well, the government is not going to implement our 15-17 agreement, and then they'll see an announcement a couple weeks' time, Minister, saying big changes at the BOJ in terms of salary. So that inequality in the society is something we have to grapple with. I don't begrudge the need for more money at Bank of Jamaica, at all levels, because I know it is also the need in the rest of the society. But this is a country in which you say to the doctor at KPH, you old strainer, to the police officer facing bullets in Mount St. at Cornwall Regional Hospital, no? You old strain. But the BOJ can't hold strain on the dollar because we have to release them to make it go up and down, even though the up seems to be more than the down. So that affects the little worker in the government service who was constrained. But there's a freedom. So that's a conflict we have to look at, because it's not just the Bank of Jamaica we're saying we're technical. People at Jump or other places saying we're technical too. So it's almost releasing a certain section of the society to, let me quote a term that might find favor with my friend senators, to run with it. But the others have to tighten the belt. That's the conflict I have in my mind as I grapple with this.
Just two responses. I totally understand that. And if that conflict didn't exist, one would go much further with the adjustments in the BOJ. The BOJ will exist in a context. It will not move to Pigeon Island or to Pedro Keys. It exists in Jamaica. And so when the BOJ governor sits in this parliament, everything is open for discussion, including, are those contracts that you have those things that has just been awarded, are those fair and reasonable? And so the response, no, but
we can talk.
Alluding to, no, use an example you mentioned about the fat salary scandal. Just the scrutiny that was brought to bear upon public bodies at that time, I think, certainly for a long period of time, and definitely had an impact on how salaries were negotiated going forward. Yes, there have been exceptions, but it had an impact. Just the public scrutiny, just shining the light on it. So while the BOJ is going to have to be in a position that it can compete for talent, and the experience is that the BOJ exists in the financial space, and it's going to have the ability to retain talent and compete beyond certain levels, national duty and service, all the things that everybody here is committed to, above other things, and therefore the acceptance of your compensation. Yes.
Chairman, they will come to the Parliament. Parliament can talk about what they have done, but can the Parliament act against what they have done?
No. Other than
no, I'm just trying to be clear.
Yeah, but
we can only talk.
But I get you. I mean, on one side we have another trade union leader who would argue the opposite point. And I think you and he need to talk on labor matters. On labor matters.
Mr. Chairman.
He should recuse himself.
Because I have to do battle with him. I wish you could come. I wish you could represent me in those conversations.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not. This is a very specific. I mean, there's one central bank, and it affects all of us. So, but I'm not quite understanding the discussion. We do recognize all the points you made, that you're going to have to get persons, you have to pay a competitive salary to get somebody who's going to be unique, and the persons in there. Would it not be that there would be an established band and specific to them, and that it is not something, I think what I'm picking up almost like, well, we have to do this, so we would want it out there. I think all these things have to be out there for the sort of transparency that we are aiming to achieve in this new act. We need to put it out there so that we don't have this problem. We have to sort of justify what's being done before it is done. Everyone up front and do that. That's number one. And number two, I think, and I think just this area of appointments and all of that, which was the point I was making earlier with the governor. I think that we need to. How do you see that? How does that happen? Who does it?
Well, in terms of your overview,
how do we
that
achieve
aspect
it?
of it you hadn't covered yet. In terms of, you've kind of, in a summary way, said, well, these are the institutional elements that are going to be introduced, and what they add by way of checks and balances within internally. Then you have the role that Parliament would play in having this biannual and possibly more, or semi-annual, twice a year anyway, opportunity to speak with the governor in this chamber or wherever we'll be. In terms of who appoints the board, who appoints the governor, who appoints the MPC non-executive members, that's really fundamental, because what we are seeing is that if that isn't, if that device doesn't work, that mechanism doesn't work well, it can really undermine the achieving of the objectives of the legislation. So that's an important issue. In relation to the governor's point, responding to me, I would just say that my views on the PBMA and what I regard as the ongoing role it ought to play in some part were really informed by the bill, what's in the bill, rather than what's in the Bank of Jamaica Act today. I saw the provisions in the bill, and I saw the exclusion of the PBMA in its entirety, which is a provision in the bill, and I felt that went far too far for my purposes. But yeah.
So the scheme, and I would want to submit that we're actually in clause by clause with the discussion, with the disadvantage that we're not making progress. You know what I mean? So these issues we can talk at length. I would want to humbly submit that we've gone an hour, that we just start the clause by clause. Very soon we'll hit into some of the meaty issues where we'll have opportunity to discuss in a focused way, issue by issue. If I could have your support on that. Thank you. Okay, so starting on page 1 of the bill, we have the title, and we move on to clause 1, subsection 1.
Just, Mr. Chairman, it's administrative. Member Golding referred to the memo he had sent to you. Was it printed and circulated?
Yes, it definitely was.
I don't.
And it's in his comments. Look at this sheet here.
No,
it's in the matrix.
It's in the matrix, but I mean the memo as a whole. Could we it's just a request. Could we have it circulated?
Yes, sure, no problem with that.
I don't know if it was tabled at a JSC meeting as like documents that were given to the members in hard copy.
No, it wasn't. I don't think it was
hard copy for members.
Right, meeting. The same way we got the copy, like what the different groups, we
did get hard copies.
We did get hard copies?
Yes. You weren't at the last meeting, you know.
Oh, maybe
you were on strike.
Maybe that's why I don't have it. Maybe that's why it's missing from my package. But I thought you'd have at least not punish me by destroying my papers.
Just as you were about to jump into clause 1, just to make the point that on the first page of the matrix, there doesn't seem to be anything that would be of legislative import.
That was my view as well.
Yeah. They're obviously important points. But,
yes. So the comments really start at clause 2. So if I could take clause 1 as having, all right, so clause 2, which deals with definitions of the deputy governor, governor, senior deputy governor, supervisor, etc. And there were comments from the JCC and from Member Golding, and Member Golding in particular was advocating the insertion of a definition on bankrupt, monetary liabilities, and so forth. You want to jump in here?
Thank you very much, Chair. I wondered if I might just impose and introduce my team, and to indicate that, with your permission, we'll have various members will be covering different sections here as we go through. Senior Deputy Governor John Robinson to my left, Deputy Governor Maureen Sims, who's the Deputy Supervisor, is in the back here. General Counsel and Deputy Governor Karen Chinqui Aiken is to my left, and Financial Controller Ian Williams behind me here. Senior Legal Counsel Celeste McCalla is in the back, and Senior Legal Counsel Melrose Stewart Wigan is right behind me, and Financial Analyst Andre Murray is over in the corner. So I just would like to introduce the team. Not everybody will be speaking, but we would, with your permission, cover some of the points here. I'd also, if I could just add that the bank found the various representations extremely constructive and useful from all of them, and so we hope that in in some of these proposed answers that they may satisfy, some of them may not. With that, can I invite, with your permission, Chairman, General Counsel to respond on some comments on these issues.
Chairman and members of the committee, in relation to Clause 2 of the bill and Section 2 of the Act, the definitions first refer to Deputy Governor, Governor, Senior Deputy Governor, Supervisor, Supervisory Department, really seek to reconcile, make some corrections in terms of section numbers and to reconcile some definitions per the Bank of Jamaica Act and the Banking Services Act. And so just very quickly, the definitions of Deputy Governor and Senior Deputy Governor refer to Section 6D and 6D of the statute, while the current law speaks to Section 6. So it really is a correction of the section number in terms of the definition, those two definitions. In relation to the definition of governor, also, I skipped over that because governor's definition speaks to Section 6 in the current statute, while it ought to have referred to 6A. Those section number changes really came out, I believe, from the 2014 amendments, and so it hadn't caught up. So these changes are reflecting those. In relation to the definition of supervisor, this has also been updated to coincide with the Banking Services Act. And more specifically, just to mention, highlight for you, is that under the current definition, it speaks to supervisor of banks and financial institutions appointed under Section 34B, while the Banking Services Act actually lifts out and speaks about the financial holding companies and the specified financial institutions. And so that definition also, committee members, tries to reconcile those. Just very quickly again, Supervisory Department also is seeking to bring the definition within BSA, the Banking Services Act, and speaks in relation to the Supervisory Department. Currently, it speaks about the Department of Supervision of Banks and Financial Institutions, which is not an expression that is now used. So we move now, if you will, to the next section, which deals with new definitions.
Sorry,
did I miss?
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Sorry,
I was going to come to those after, but
sorry, just for clarity. So you're saying those are changes to be made?
To be made, yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, those two are interpretations.
Those are definitions that are going to be inserted in the Bank of Jamaica Act, and those insertions are being made by this bill. So they're largely correcting or making consistent certain phrases that are already defined in the Act, but are no longer accurately defined.
And so there are some new ones, though. These are the current ones that would be amended. Yeah. I will come to the points made by Member Gold in a minute. I just want to complete these. And so quickly moving on to B, Clause 2B of the bill. These introduce new sections, fiscal year, and fiscal year, which is being proposed, definition is proposed there. I don't think there's any great magic to it. It's the 12 months ending the 31st of March in any year. Just for information, fiscal year is used at Clause 13 of the bill, which speaks to Section 9, and also at Clause 17 of the bill, which addresses Section 36 of the Act, just for information. So that definition is there, and I think that's really just for clarity. There's a definition here for monetary liabilities, and that is new. That is needed, that definition is needed when we come to look at Section 9 of the bill, and so members will see that definition there. And I'm coming to Member Golding's points, which I have noted here. There's also a definition of marketable securities, and marketable securities will be required for 3 sections in the Act. Section 8, which is a section to do with capital, Section 9, which also has to do with distributions, and Section 36, which deals with advances to government. To mention that Member Golding, in his comments, had suggested that a definition of bankrupt be inserted, and this is a position, Chairman and committee members, which we think would be most useful. And when the suggestion subject to the draftsman would be that that speaks to meaning within the meaning set out in the definition within the meaning set out in the Insolvency Act. So that would be, what we would suggest. In relation to...
Excuse me, Chairman.
Yes, please. Yes.
Can I just make a comment on that issue?
Please, go ahead.
In terms of the definition of bankruptcy or bankrupt. And I note the suggestion being made by the Bank of Jamaica. However, there are places in the bill where we already explain that, for instance, on page 3 of the bill, that a person is not bankrupt within the meaning of the Insolvency Act. So really, what we could do is either add those words wherever they weren't. So there are areas in the bill where we just talk about bankrupt, but we didn't explain that it is within the meaning of the Insolvency Act. So either we amend those provisions to make it clear. If we put in the definition, we will have to adjust the areas of the bill where we already said bankrupt within the meaning of the Insolvency Act. So you'll have to decide how you would...
I think we should have a defined term, which says bankrupt means bankrupt within the meaning of the Insolvency Act, and in the body of the bill, we use the word bankrupt, rather than having some references, having to repeat that reference each time it's used, which is a bit cumbersome, which is why defined terms are useful. Yeah, so that would be my preference. But,
I agree with that.
I think that is acceptable.
Thank you. The next one, Member Golding had mentioned in his comments, was the change paragraph A, the definition of monetary liabilities. He suggested that an executive agency should be changed to executive agencies, and that's I think agreeable. The third one was a query that he raised, which is under the definition of monetary liabilities. He asked whether the entire consolidated fund is held with the Bank of Jamaica, and I'm sure to say yes, it is. All of the consolidated fund is held with the Bank of Jamaica.
Well, it better be. But we don't have, we need to, the Treasury single account needs to.
There were times in the past when they had accounts with other banks, so I wasn't sure what the current status was. Yeah.
Yes, in the good old days.
Mm-hmm. It was very profitable for them, I think.
On the next one has to do with marketable securities. Member Golding had made a comment that it should be clear that the securities must be issued in accordance with the PDMA, the Public Debt Management Act. And our understanding is that all GOJ securities are issued according to the PDMA. To take account of members' point, if you would look at your bill, and I'll just say what the suggestion is. If you look at the bill, page 3, marketable securities, our suggestion is that at the end of that definition, let me just read it quickly. Marketable securities means such securities as may be agreed between the bank and the minister that can be readily bought and sold at a fair price. We are suggesting that it be added there, and which shall be charged on the consolidated fund. And just to say, that interesting is that this is the expression that is in the current act at 9.3b as well.
Yeah, but that probably predates the Public Debt Management Act, those words. It's kind of, we have a Public Debt Management Act which governs the issuance of debt by the government. As the bill is currently worded, it just said the securities are to be agreed by the bank, and the minister was at large whether those are government securities or, junk bonds or whatever.
I'm actually not sure the context in which marketable securities is used.
Yeah.
Because there's a more general financial term for marketable securities, which wouldn't be limited to issues by public bodies.
Yes. Well,
Mr. Chairman, again, just another administrative request. Could members get a copy of the Principal Act? So just make it a little easy for the cross-referencing as we're working through the bill, because it's easier then sometimes to understand the context.
Yeah.
Or the relevant sections.
I think the left-hand pages.
It's on the left hand. It's where?
Most things.
The left-hand pages would only be the provisions which are being amended.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the
But
whole of
sometimes
the bill.
you need a section to get the context.
Yeah, well, there may be a reference to a section which you need to see.
Sure, we can have it available.
Just for the next meeting.
Sure.
For the next meeting.
Yeah.
But because I'm trying to understand
the phrase marketable securities is used in the bill. One of my recollection, because I wrote this memo 5 months ago, but my recollection when I was preparing it was that one of the important references to it is that it is a form of asset that is going to be used to recapitalize the central bank. All right? And therefore, I had assumed that they really were supposed to be Government of Jamaica securities duly issued in accordance with the statute that governs the issuance of Government of Jamaica securities, which is the Public Debt Management Act. That act says that public debt of Jamaica is charged on the consolidated fund. And it also says that properly guaranteed instruments guaranteed by the government are charged on the consolidated fund.
So marketable securities here is limited to government-issued marketable securities.
If I may,
for the purpose of the recapitalization, yes. I would imagine it is. Yes. I don't know if there are other, if the phrase is used in other contexts.
No, I think the member Golden is correct. The usage of what the bank the Act currently has, and has always had, is the ability to provide capital to the bank by just by transfer from the consolidated fund. That's what we would think of as cash, more colloquially, or by securities. That's that issued by the government that is a charge on the consolidated fund. The change that's being introduced here is to add the fact that these securities, well, two things are happening when we get to the clause 8 and 9, where the only way to put the capital in by the government will be through the issuance of these securities, not by cash. That's one. And two, that the securities need to be marketable. So I appreciate Member Bunting's point that marketable securities has a wider sense, but in this Act it's really the qualification marketable that is the change here, to say they're marketable securities. And then we have to define what we mean, which is what the definition it provides.
But even
the point raised by Member Golding, which we take the point that you want these to be sort of issued properly as proper securities. The reason to suggest
also, Governor, to the extent that they are not issued in accordance with the Public Debt Management Act, that would compromise their marketability, because it would import a certain legal deficiency in those securities, because the intention of the Public Debt Management Act is that all debt of the government must be issued pursuant to in accordance with that Act. So this is why rather than use the old formulation of being charged on the consolidated fund, which used to be a myriad of different debt statutes, and that predates the existence of the Public Debt Management Act, we now have that Act. And I just think that these marketable securities should just be issued in accordance with that Act.
So Chair, if I may just, the point I wanted to make is that we appreciate that point, and the reason, and the weight of it, the value of it. The reason to suggest keeping it broader, and it's a question that the committee obviously would decide on, to balance this question. The Bank of Jamaica Act doesn't change a lot, and we try not to amend too frequently. So that there's some language. So, for example, the very provision securities issued without a charge on the consolidated fund, that language has been there from the beginning. As you mentioned, there have been different regimes to do with public debt. There's now a PDMA. There were LRS acts, T-bill acts. I mean, it's possible for that to change in the future as well. And so, in a sense, a language that is broad enough that captures what's essential, which is that it's marketable, which is what the central bank will be evaluating in accepting them, whether they're marketable, and secondly, that they are a charge on the fund, are the minimum required. It doesn't mean that what has been suggested is offensive at all. It just would open the door now to the need to amend, if the PDMA changes to something else in the future, which obviously could be managed, but this would just avoid that.
Chairman, could you just clarify for me why at marketable securities we need the agreement of the minister with the bank for these issues?
Because the marketable securities are used by the central bank to conduct open market operations, and that's how they one of the ways through which they affect monetary policies. The central bank may have a view at the time to say, hey, don't give me any 3 years. That's not going to help me right now. I need a mixture of 10 years. Don't give me any 30 years. Don't give me any this. Give me some fixed rate and mix it with some variable. So there has to be a conversation.
We've had in the past, if I may just add, there have been securities issued legally that were 50 years, I think it was zero coupon or close to zero coupon. I mean, there are ways in which you could use this as a way to effectively transfer value, or not transfer the value required. And so that's the reason to require agreement between the bank and the minister. And once you have this clearly set out, my experience has been that that's what people will do. But the temptation or the inclination or the incentive will always be there for the central bank to take securities that might be theoretically marketable in some way or called marketable by a lawyer. But in practice, the value, will not be what is intended. And you want to make sure that that even if a governor or a central bank were minded to do it, that we talk about that transparency, everybody would be able to see that, okay, maybe there's something dodgy going on here. But that said, the need to sort of define marketable was what we were trying to insert here, because otherwise we would be leaving it up in the air as to what's marketable.
Transparency can come from publishing it. What I'm trying to see is who is protected, the minister or the bank, when an agreement is required. In other words, if these securities are there, it's required that the minister and you must agree. So if he wants to give you a 50-year thing, you can say no. So in that sense, you are protected. Is there any protection here for the ministers by this clause? What I'm trying to get, I want to make sure.
De facto, this protects the bank, in my mind. This is protected.
So they may want entirely
you both have to agree, but since you are the one issuing it, I would assume you would agree, because you're the one issuing it. This protection is entirely for the bank, so you can't unilaterally impose it on the bank. And I do remember, Governor, I think it was coming out of the FinSAC era, when a big chunk of securities, which quite frankly was just an accounting window dressing, but had no value as such. It was extremely long, zero coupon, and it was just meeting and making sure the balance sheet balanced. So I think this is entirely for the protection of the bank, because previously the minister could just give the governor and say, here, our debt is settled.
But in reality, they both have to agree. So in a sense, it protects both, because if the BOJ had a strong preference for a particular configuration and the minister felt that would have some adverse fiscal impact or something else with the overall debt stock that he didn't like, or the overall parameters of the debt management strategy as a mix between
depends on what the yield curve looks like, right? Yeah, the yield curve could be such that certain securities are going to impose a high interest cost in the next few years because of the maturity of them. So yes, it both have to agree, and it's important that both agree.
I mean, Chairman, if I may say, in saying protect the bank, that may be shorthand, but we should understand that the bank doesn't have a sort of a separate interest. it is the fact that this sort of transfer, which we would call quasi-fiscal transfers or money printing of some form, that undermines the value of money and makes inflation higher, other things remaining equal. So it's really avoiding these sort of things that is very hard for a public, any public, even sophisticated people, to spot when it's happening. But then once you've done it and put it in the balance sheet, you see the impact on inflation or the ability to fight inflation over the subsequent years.
Should we leave it then as loose as anything to be agreed between the thing? But maybe marketable securities, for example, there should be some limit on the term of the...
Well, those are possible. I think, though, that
generally
when
speaking,
if I can add,
the 50-year zero coupon should not be, even by agreement.
So there's a bit of a belt and braces, which is an important thing, different levels. So remember that we also we have to operate under accounting standards. So, that kind of thing that happened in the past would have a more direct impact on the capital of the bank, because you'd have, if you've got securities that really weren't worth what it appeared to be on the face of it, 50-year zero coupon, for example, then you'd find in the same period or the next period, you'd find that the capital that this these amendments seek to create a sense of a capital amount will dip, that the bank's board will have to then account for to the Parliament, where did you lose all this money? And it will come right back to recapitalization. So the transparency and accountability will protect, I think, this, but this is like a front line just to say.
But it also says they must be that can be readily bought and sold at a fair price. So if you have some very peculiar security that isn't easily traded in the market, it probably wouldn't comply with that. But I just want to make the point on the other issue about charge on the consolidated fund. If it is not issued in accordance with the Public Debt Management Act, it is probably illegal debt, unenforceable debt, and won't be charged the consolidated fund. Well, that too, because if the market is aware of it, they won't want to touch it. So I do reiterate.
What is the damage of having it that?
No, none at all. What the member proposes.
I heard you have to just be vigilant if you change the Public Debt Management Act.
Because these regimes do change over time, and the Bank of Jamaica Act doesn't get amended. These clauses don't get amended much, and neither should they. You don't want to touch them.
And hopefully you'll have such big surpluses in your balance sheet then that you won't need any further recapitalization. So it will be a historic definition rather than.
You're correct, but what we do hope is that the growth of the economy is such that, remember, the liabilities will rise, and that's why we'll need more capital.
He has plans.
He has plans.
All right, so we'll accept the public debt in accordance with the Public Debt Management Act. Okay, moving on now to Section 3, which deals with...
No, hold on. We're following the matrix?
Well, we're following the bill and consulting the matrix.
The matrix, right.
Yeah.
There's under the Chamber of Commerce.
I don't know if this applies to this clause. I don't know why it's here. It should be at another section, because it's talking about membership of the MPC.
And national emergency.
Yeah, that's in a different section of the bill.
I was trying to reconcile with what this was.
Yeah. These are in a different section of the bill. You'll remember to come back to it when we...
Okay.
To avoid missing
it when we do that, though, it would be useful to know which provisions in the bill these are relevant to, and maybe put a note on the relevant page. Look at page 2. So we
don't jump over it.
Yeah, and so we don't ignore
Chairman,
it.
we can
it's
do that
easy to
if the members agree. We can make a note and then let you know as we go on. Yeah, because we actually have been tracking it. I just have to find it.
Right.
So that when we get to that point, we want to be sure we are ready to answer each submission.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I just would mention that we did see a comment made by Member Golding, which related to a proposed new 2C to do with the expressions, advice of consultation with, etc. So I don't know if you want.
Yes, that's what I thought. I was in 3. Let's discuss that.
Right, but I'm not sure if it's in the matrix. I haven't been able to look yet, but I wanted to perhaps address this.
Yes. Okay. Let me just introduce. In Member Golden's comments, he had made the point that the bill makes frequent reference to the terms on the advice of, upon the recommendation of, and after consultation with, and was proposing that the bill have some kind of definition, broad enough definition, for what these words mean. I think that is very open to that, and I believe you had some suggestions on that.
Yes.
You want to share what those suggestions are?
So, Chair, if you would agree that I could probably circulate that just to make it easier to make the point.
Okay.
Through the clerk. So while you're going to give it to Anila, the clerk, give it to the clerk. Take it to the clerk. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So, Chair and committee members, while that is happening, just very quickly, let me tell you what that document looks like, not to delay too much. So there is indeed a lot of references in this statute, in the bill and also in the Act in general, that talks about some of these expressions. And so what you will see before you is a document which we have not been able to share it fully with the Attorney General's office or the OPC, but it's here just to guide and be helpful to members if that is, if it will do that. So just very quickly, when you look at that document, which is being circulated, and you'll get a copy. Is it too much?
No, just to be clear.
No,
just to be clear. I don't know.
Yeah.
You complicated it here. The first page has the proposed definitions, and then what you did in the subsequent pages was to print everywhere on advice of occurs and print everywhere after consultation with. And so just be comprehensive.
What an industrious
it's just
senior
extra.
counsel you have.
Yeah. So,
okay, that was brought up. So in the document, just quick, I'm not going to go through it at all. I'm not a long-winded person. But in the first part is the recommendation, and there is also reference to where in the bill these expressions appear, and then finally, and I would say sections in the current Act that those expressions appear, because members might want to know what the definitions will relate to. So just very quickly, for example, and this is important thing, it's page 1. And that is on the advice of. To tell you that the only place on the advice of is mentioned is to do with the fit and proper determination. So that is useful to know. I think that when you're looking at on the advice of, it has to do with a scenario where you're looking at fit and proper in the context of board members, you're looking at it in the context of the MPC members, and you're looking at it in the context of the FPC, that's the Financial Policy Committee member. That's the only time on the advice of is referred. So on the advice of, really in this proposed definition that we have here, is talking about that there must be an advice received, because obviously if you get an advice then you must receive it. So that's the first point. And then the second point is that the minister in that context, when he's making a decision, must take the advice into account. However, because it's an advice, wouldn't have no obligation to act in accordance with the advice. So he must get the advice, or she must get the advice, must take it into account, and there'll be no obligation to act in accordance with the advice. And that's in relation to fit and proper. On the recommendation of, is useful to know is that this statute already has a formulation for what on the recommendation of means, and that may be found at section 14. And the components of that are, first of all, you must have a recommendation that has been made. Secondly, if there's a disagreement on the recommendation.
Sorry, Counsel, that is section 14 of
14
of the
existing Act. Yes, 14.2, which you don't have. It relates to currency notes. If I could just look at that, since you don't have the benefit of that particular one, I'll just say what that says. Under the section that deals with denominations and forms of notes and coins, it says that, for example, the minister may, after consultation with the bank, approve the denominations, I'm short forming it, form and design of notes and coins. And then at B, which is the one I want to get to, it says, by order determine the standard weight and composition of the coins to be issued by the bank. And then at subsection 2, it says, the power of the minister under paragraph A of subsection 1, that was to do with the denominations, form and design, what that looks like, shall be exercised on the recommendation of the bank. So, however, that where on any occasion the minister disagrees with a recommendation of the bank, he shall require the bank to reconsider that recommendation and may, if a recommendation acceptable to him is not thereafter furnished by the bank, exercise the power aforesaid on the occasion otherwise than on the recommendation of the bank. So I'm just saying that there is guidance there, and the formulation at B of the document in front of you says that, pretty much. Must be a recommendation. If there's a disagreement, it goes back one time for reconsideration, and if at that time there's still no agreement, then the party making the power could go ahead and do it.
So just to make the point that that formulation in section 14 arises in relation to coinage, notes and coins, a very particular subject matter.
Right.
The recommendation, the use of the word recommendation or recommend, or some derivative of that word in the bill, and maybe in other places in the Act, I don't know, Principal Act, may well cover very different issues. I think we just need to bear that in mind in thinking whether the section 14 model, which is the old model that's in the Act already, is an ideal and appropriate model just to adopt going forward, or whether we should, given the other context that formulation is now used in, whether this is sufficient for our purposes. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, maybe we should. You won't have time to look at it and deal with this one at the next meeting. Let's move to section 3, clause 3.
Exactly.
Have members be able to consider this and come back.
And so as we go through, even if we go beyond 3, because we've identified in this which are the provisions, then when we get to them, if we get to 6, for example, 6D, then we can move on and come back when you're ready.
So this is responding to your suggestion, Member Golden, of including some definitions, and these are a proposal of what the definitions could look like. Right? And next meeting we can discuss them.
But while we're updating the bill, why on earth would a minister want to be involved in determining the standard weight and composition of coins to be issued by the bank?
Other than to get rid of coins.
19.
Coins used to matter a lot.
That's right. It's a different Jamaica. Who knows? Bitcoin.
It still matter, especially for
standard weight.
For many of your constituents.
But there was when the 50 cent first.
Coins matter for many constituents. I would say they are significant at a certain level of income.
Yeah. Sorry? So clause 3.
Okay, clause 3. So we're now at the clause 3, which is the fit and proper section, and it's 2A of the Act, clause 3, and just to say that
clause 3 proposes, just introduce it so everybody can follow. And then we can go to the comments, and then we can go to the responses to the comments.
Yes.
So it introduces a new section 2A that defines who is regarded as fit and proper.
And this applies to the board, the statutory committee members, which you had indicated before.
Right. So before, there's even though commercial banks, merchant banks, directors and managers would be required to satisfy fit and proper criteria, there was no such fit and proper criteria for the board of the central bank or for senior executives of the central bank. And this is proposing to introduce fit and proper criteria for all board members and executives and committee members.
Yes, and that's
which will be adjudicated by who? Sorry.
We want to go through all of this. So it always has to be.
And we're saying it's the same standard, the same rigorous standard of fit and proper that will be applied in both cases.
You get your revenge now.
So the BSA actually covers fit and proper for the supervisory committee. Same standards. The difference with the bill is who's to determine it. In the supervisory committee example, under the Banking Services Act, it is a supervisor who determines this. In relation to the proposal before the committee, it would be the minister, if I'm not mistaken, on the advice of the governor. And it was thought, I believe, that it would not be appropriate for the supervisor, who is the rationale for the minister on the advice of the governor instead of the supervisory committee is that it would not be appropriate for the supervisory committee to determine the fitness and propriety of the board which it is subordinate to. And this is why the proposal is as we have it.
So the governor has to be fit and proper? Or is that a requirement in relation to the governor, or that's
obviously a new requirement?
We make no comment on the incumbent.
Representation, or do I need to? You can help me. Said it again.
No, seriously though, is there a fit and proper requirement for the governor going forward?
I think as a staff member and the other executives, he's a board member. Right, but
in the schedule to the Banking Services Act, there was some.
He's not appointed as an appointed. He's not an appointing member. He's an executive officer, and so he would, I'm assuming, under the provisions when you're hiring, that is where the fit and proper. Yeah, there's not. There's no written requirement for it.
But there would have to be, though. I mean,
so the staff of the bank don't have a specific fit and proper requirement that the bank has to be sure its staff are equipped. I think the governor is being dealt with in the same vein.
I think given the issues that we have had about this independence, etc., that we do have to have all persons, whether they're board, committee, everyone who is involved in this operation, executives, otherwise.
The issue, just to be careful with, is that we're not, in a sense, you're dealing with the, who should guard the guardian, because the entity that is doing the fit and proper, these are the staff of the bank. So where there's a judgment call and there are issues. So the issue that you have to grapple with, and that's what we're talking about here, is for the persons who are going to now be responsible for deciding who's fit and proper, who should that be? So right now we're proposing that technically the work is done by those who are doing it for everybody else in the system. So the same supervisory staff are doing it, but judgments are made in fit and proper, as we know. And so when there's a judgment call to be made, who should make it? If we leave it as the bank in effect, then essentially I would have a chance to decide who my successor is, because I can essentially veto whatever names are being put forward. I mean, you hope I'm doing it properly as the supervisor, but how do you make sure of that? And I think that's the issue, the core issue we're dealing with here. So the principle of everybody should be fit and proper is a given. It's the issue of how to administer that in a way that makes sense. And the proposal is that the minister makes decisions and the bank will do its same technical work and provide the advice. I think we do have to look at, Minister, whether you should apply this to the governor and the deputy governors as they get appointed.
Just for clarification,
not
though,
sure
the opening words of 2A say that for the purpose of this act, an individual, whether in Jamaica or elsewhere, is a fit and proper person if. So this is only relevant to provisions in the Bank of Jamaica Act, which require somebody to be fit and proper. That formulation is used. And in the bill itself, it applies that formulation, the fit and proper requirement, to the directors of the bank and the new committee members. Is that right? Right. In terms of the staff of the bank going up to the governor, the phrase isn't currently used at all.
Not in the statute, no, but in practice, best practice and hiring practices, Governor.
Right.
Yeah, but
this definition though is not specific to the monetary policy committee or the board of the bank. It's this definition that will be used across the board for anyone who, directors or managers of of licensees.
No. That's a separate statute.
Yes.
The terms are probably similar. The terms are probably modeled on a similar. I don't know if they're identical or not.
They are, except for the point to do with who hires, who determines it.
Yeah.
But it was lifted from the Banking Services Act.
Right.
But to your point, Member Bunting, the provisions, when you have the definition here, now you have to look in the Act itself to see where it comes up, and it comes up at 3 places. And one is to do with the appointed members of the board in the schedule to the Bank of Jamaica Act, and in relation to the MPC appointments and the FPC appointments. So while this definition sounds general, one has to watch where it appears, and it appears in those 3 places.
And where it is particularly specific to, in terms of the committees and the board itself.
Yes, and I mean, I can give you the section numbers if you like.
You know,
but it's there.
You can just quickly point us to them.
Sure. So in the schedule, paragraph 2E, I'll have to tell you the page, but it's in the schedule, paragraph 2E, which is towards the end of the bill. And at section 34 FB 5A for MPC members, and section 34 FI 5A for the FPC members. I can look for them for you now. So the board, which I mentioned, schedule paragraph 2E, that's somewhere at the back.
What page of the bill is that?
I'm going to tell you.
What page of the bill is that reference? No, I'm looking at
page
the back.
30, at top of page 30.
Right, 2E.
You saw that
said?
one, yes.
2E?
Of the bill. 30, 30E.
Yes, looking at that. Mm-hmm.
And then now we're looking for 34.
But I see 2A reference, a new 2A.
There's 34.
2A, which is this, which is a page 3.
You found that one, 34F. And then for 34FB 5A, you're going to look for page 14, top somewhere around page 14. Page 14, 5A is mentioned there. The appointed members shall be persons who satisfy fit and proper criteria, section 2A.
Yeah.
And that's that one. And then FI5 is FI5 is later on.
Chairman, no, just looking
page
at
19.
Sorry,
19.
just looking at it and taking into consideration the
20.
comments of the governor. Look, just in a general sense, I think it just makes sense that everyone who is affiliated with Bank of Jamaica should pass pit and proper. That to me is just a basic. Point you're making is how do you effect this? And you said there's a board that deals with supervision, right? So I suspect that everybody who is within the organization, directors, etc., all of that will, the actual administration will go through the board of supervision, a committee, sorry. It then goes to the governor who will act on advice of the minister. So I don't have a difficulty.
The governor chairs that committee, and then all the members on it report, the internal members report to the governor. So is this the point I'm making?
Exactly, but I'm saying, so therefore the responsibility of ensuring everybody in the organization is fit and proper would fall on the governor, who would then...
The thing with that though, remember, in the banking system, it's really the person's at the top, the person's with big responsibility.
But that's the point, but that's where I'm coming to. I'm just making the point that for everybody else other than the governor, I don't think there's a problem. I think this captures it. What I'm looking at...
Member McNeil, I just want to make sure you're on the right footing in terms of your understanding. The Bank of Jamaica, with these amendments, will require a fit and proper test to be applied to the appointed board members and to the appointed committee members of the MPC and the other committee, FPC. Yes. In terms of the senior management of the bank, in practice, they would want to ensure that they're hiring persons who are fit and proper, but there's no statutory requirement for that, and there is no adjudication process that exists for the persons who do have a statutory requirement of fit and proper.
Why? Why?
Well, and I think the governor's point is that they would be adjudicating themselves.
No, but I go back to the point I was making. All of this, absolutely, but in hiring somebody who is coming on, it is the responsibility of the governor to deal with that, to ensure fit and proper.
Why isn't there,
No,
for example,
I'm
a
just
general...
so therefore, one
Yeah.
second, ma'am. So my point was that if you have a governor who is the head of the organization, who is to ensure in consultation with the minister, fit and proper of the organization, the only thing that would be left would be who would ensure fit and proper of the governor. So I thought that's...
I would.
There goes your independence, frankly.
What?
There goes your independence, incidentally.
No, but why would... No, but I'm just saying, how could ensuring fit and proper of a governor take away the independence of the governor?
That's not what I meant to say, and I apologize.
Yeah,
no, not the governor. I thought you meant the bank, the staff of the bank.
Yeah, what I'd propose, ma'am, in response to what you're saying, incorporating the executives who are on the board, I think, is important. But to say for the entire organization, I think you get into some very difficult territory there.
No, I think the level that ideally this would apply to would be the same as applies to commercial banks and other licensees, whatever that level that is and above, you know. But even if you don't have the same formulation applying to the staff, the senior staff in that way, maybe there ought to be a statement in the statute that persons who are being appointed to those positions ought to be persons who would satisfy the requirements of Section 2A, you know? Yeah, and that should be a given. So that if somebody really didn't, that could be a basis on which you would say, you know, that person should not be appointed. But yes.
For example, if the appropriate level, I believe the levels at the bank are governor, senior deputy governor, director.
Chairman would have to define those levels.
So would say, I think, just off the top, so those are the levels. Yeah. It could be that it's deputy governor level.
Those are the people appointed.
Those are the people appointed. Everybody else is permanent staff.
Yeah. I mean, there are other contract people, but there's a level. To be a deputy governor, you're appointed for X period.
So
what obtains in you supervise other banks? What obtains in commercial banks? Do they have to meet fit and proper?
So, if I may, the fit and proper standard is something created by supervisors and supervisory regimes to oversee these entities that are interfacing with the public. So the regulator, you know, it's an imposed thing by these laws. We're now seeking to impose the particular standard designed for that to appointments from outside into the bank, which would be these people directing the bank for the reasons that you've already accepted.
So why do you feel that that should not be the same standard held to the Bank of Jamaica?
Well, so when you say Bank of Jamaica, I take it you mean the staff of the bank or the senior staff, and this is what the chair was speaking to. Are we speaking of the deputy governors or the staff below? And the reason I'm saying this is that now the bank is an employer of these staff. It is its job to make sure that they are suitable for the job, however you define that. So the question would be whether you need a statutory imposition for them. And I think the chairman was approaching the point of, well, what about these appointed people? Your point, governor, deputy governors, and so on. And I think that it might be useful for us to take a look at how that's handled, you know, in other jurisdictions, just so that we don't create a sort of circularity, you know, that doesn't achieve what you're looking for. But I think the principle that we're hearing, which I think is something that's uncontroversial, incontrovertible, is that the senior people in the Bank of Jamaica must be fit and proper. They must meet these standards. I don't think that's something anybody is impatient of debate. The question is just how to structure that. And perhaps I could do a little research, Chair, on other jurisdictions. We could also consider Member Golding's suggestion, you know, that there be something put in.
I think
even if it doesn't address the question of how do you now, once you say you must meet a fit and proper standard, the question of how is it adjudicated, and then it becomes can become a juridical kind of issue. We have to look at all those issues.
It as a fit and proper test in that way. I thought it would be a statement of principle that in hiring somebody to one of those vaulted positions, you would be obliged to ensure that they comply with the requirements of Section 2A.
Seem unreasonable to me, but can we look at how that works and maybe?
Sure. Member Bunting wanted to come in.
Yeah, it just struck me in this discussion that probably for transparency, I should declare that I am one of those persons who has to pass this fit and proper scrutiny by FSC. I think now Bank of Jamaica as well. Yeah. Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, Bermuda Monetary Authority, Eastern Caribbean Monetary Authority. So I'm very familiar. We're very vetted. We're very vetted. I have to track down to the police records thing every 6 months to get a new certificate. So I'm quite familiar with the process, but perhaps because of that, there's a couple of points that I would want to make here. I think best practice is there's some authorities that are very thorough in doing their background. They don't just give you the form to fill out, but they do their own research, background checks, etc. And I think best practice would be that it not be an internal unit to the BOJ that does it for their own staff. Wouldn't we have, for example, a similar vetting capability at the FSC? So rather than the internal people being asked to do the preliminary data collection and research on people who they're going to report to, it might be in this unusual case, rather than the regulators regulating themselves, to use an alternative regulator who has a similar vetting capability. So that's one suggestion. I'm talking for the senior people. The second one is that I don't think, given now that we're extending the terms to 10 years or whatever the term we're going to settle on, I don't think the initial vetting, it should be a once and for all. Because with the passage of time, somebody who may have met the criteria year 1, maybe in year 5, developments have occurred which would now, had they been in place 5 years earlier, the person would not have passed. And it could very well compromise their person. So it could be their financial difficulties that they had got into. So I would think that there should be periodic reviews for this fit and proper assessment, whether it's every 3 years or every 5 years, given that we're making the term so long. That was the second suggestion. And the third one, and I think it's dealt with in it, is that ultimately the institution, well, I think in this case it will be the minister who will be making the final decision, which is appropriate, so that the governor is not, but even where it makes the recommendation for, where it says the minister on the advice or on the recommendation of the governor, it comes back to why I think the third party vetting might be better, because if the governor says, boy, this university economist that you are bringing to put on my thing, I know that he's a little too bright and outspoken and he might have too much influence. So let me just make sure I don't recommend him because I want somebody more compliant.
No, the minister the minister does not have to accept the recommendation.
Exactly. So I'm saying that's a good thing, but I would think it would even be better if the vetting was done by, say, the FSC, so that, there's no self-interest. I know this governor would never do that, but, as I say, we can't tell. A mistake may be made down the road. So these are just some things I want to put out there for consideration.
But I'm sure the business already have in place, Chairman, policies that provide that type of rigor. What I'm a little concerned about is that we place that burden on another institution that don't have the capacity to deal with it, don't have the capacity to treat with it. I accept the fact that at certain levels of the bank, especially what is being pointed out here, it requires that level of scrutiny. but to extend it right across, especially where the business have a recruitment policy that treats persons on short-term, fixed-term contracts, for example. That by the time you have to get around to that level of scrutiny, they would not be able to even employ the person. So we'd have to leave it to the bank in some instances to the dependency of its policies to treat with that.
All right, just trying to bring some... Oh,
before
sorry.
you bring it, I understand the proposal from Dr. McNeil. He saw the top levels, and for everybody in the bank. Oftentimes those top levels don't get these short-term contracts in the one, right? So it's the top that we're talking about here. And I got the sense that the governor is not opposed to those people being required to be fit and proper. He's saying that's a practice now. Well, it's a practice that I see no reason that we should codify in legislation. Second thing I'd love, Chairman, the fit and proper issues here at 2A1 onward. Could we get a sense of what happened in other jurisdictions? Because I kind of get the feeling that like 2A, 1A, etc., if he has not been convicted, what if somebody has left a bank in, say, Timbuktu? I don't want to go to the Middle East. Say, Timbuktu in the Middle East? No, Africa. No, right? So that person left under questionable circumstances, but not convicted. How would that play out? Because that person would probably qualify as a fit and proper person. And so I'd love to see how other jurisdictions deal with it and not just limit it to whether you're not convicted, because
things like that are objective.
Sorry?
There will always be judgment that will be required, and we hope that we'll have people of good judgment that fill the halls of government, etc. We can't get away from judgment, and so when you are going to put something into law, you need to have objective measures. But it doesn't mean
Chairman, you know what I asked for? I asked for what other jurisdictions with their experience and their numbers
can we comment?
With it. That's what I'm saying. It's not about judgment. I want to know other people have dealt with it. Then I can say, yeah, it's a judgment issue. But what if the US? What if Canada? What if England? What if Australia have dealt with it differently? I'd love to know, because
can I take that as a question? I'm presuming as a question relating to, do other jurisdictions have this type of fit and proper test for appointments to the board and the senior levels, or the board as we are proposing here? I don't have the answer to that, Chair, right here. I do believe we are breaking some ground in this approach, because what we, policy-wise, Jamaica, not the government and the trend of this discussion, we have sought to take something that's a standard that is applied to licensees, the people that you're supervising, and brought that same standard formally into the governance of the institution. And Jamaica has its own reasons to do that. I will do some checking and come back on that experience in the other jurisdictions that we've been looking at. These are formal fit and proper tests, as opposed to, remember, the fact is these are appointments by the government that would have its own filters that aren't statutory tests to decide who to appoint. So we have to keep that in mind. If the question, though, and I wonder maybe relating to this type of standard for directors and senior managers of deposit-taking institutions that take the funds of the public in deposits and are responsible for them, if that's the question, then Jamaica's standard is not dissimilar to others. The specificity varies. We'll get some statistics and information for the committee on that. So that what is the objective is to exclude from certain positions persons who on the one hand meet some very strict levels, like not being a bankrupt, but on the other hand meet levels where there's a judgment applied are you a person of sound probity? Obviously, we agree persons in charge must have sound probity, but how do you define who has sound probity? We have to look for evidence and make some judgments and so on. Can you exercise competence? Will your appointment result in a conflict of interest? Do you possess the knowledge, skills, etc.? These are the sort of things that are being applied now in our fit and proper test in Jamaica and have been for years. That, as I said, I will find out, get some more granular data. But we are operating a kind of a standard that is not invented here.
If I could just add one thing on this so quickly, just to say, it's a combination of objective yardsticks and subjective judgment. Yeah, there's both that goes into this. Yeah, and in relation to the objective ones, I think it'd be very hard to have an objective yardstick which didn't involve conviction, because there's a presumption of innocence. Yeah,
I'm not arguing to remove conviction.
Yeah,
I'm saying event less than conviction as well.
Right, but if there's a presumption of innocence, the fact that you've been charged can't in and of itself disqualify you. And I mean, in some instances you may have been totally wrongly charged. In some instances you might be very guilty, but you couldn't be convicted. Now I don't see on what basis you could distinguish between the two, or where you lie on the spectrum. So,
and in some cases they may not be charged. They may have left in questionable circumstances, which need to be taken into account.
Well, that's why you have the sound
look at
probity
C1.
point.
How would C1?
C1 is supposed to deal with that.
But Senator Brown, you said something else though. You said that you would not be. Just clarify. I want to kind of summarize where we are. But I think you said something that, with respect, you don't, in terms of codifying it, it should happen. But codifying it is not something that you think should happen.
He's in favor of codifying.
Oh, you're in favor of codifying.
Rather than just leave it as a practice. Okay. In relation to the senior staff of the bank.
Fine.
Yeah.
All right, so let's summarize where we are in this discussion.
What you have in some territories, Chair, what you have is the statutory obligations, and you have code of conduct. I know the bank have a rigorous code of conduct that is applied to certain staff. So maybe you might want to look at it, and when you review what other territories do, we can see how we can come up with that with the best mix.
Right. So am I hearing that we're saying applying essentially Section 2A to the senior members of the bank, i.e. and defined as deputy governors up?
Just one, in terms of where that threshold lies, do you have below deputy governor, what's the most senior position below deputy governor?
Division chief or executive director.
Okay, and would typically somebody in that position in a commercial bank, they have to be fit and proper? Yes, Mr. Sims said
it would depend on what they're actually doing.
My recollection of how the BOJ interprets the language in the banking statutes about who that has words like manager and so on are used. Yeah. They apply it to protect the public by ensuring that once you're in a position where you're making decisions that could affect
that's what I meant by it depends on what you're doing. So, for example, the person who is responsible for the maintenance of the building and elevators and so on may not.
The key functionaries are deputy governor, meaning who is responsible for the certain functions of the bank, the person responsible for, research, or the person responsible for, dealing with market operations, or the person responsible. Those, I think the deputy governor level is where that responsibility really.
So, for example, in the room here, I mean, I don't know how many of the staff who are here would be deputy governor and above. They're all important enough to be here. So I'm just saying where you draw the line matters. I mean, how many deputy governors are there in the bank? 5. Yeah.
And the senior deputy governor.
Including senior?
No, under senior deputy.
And as senior, 5 plus 1.
So it would be 7 officers in all.
Mm-hmm. And if I may, Chair, the proposal in this reform of governance is to recall that we're changing, how folks are appointed, subject to the committee. So one thought is that there are 3 of these executives: the governor, the senior deputy governor, and 1 deputy governor. It may be that you want to apply that particular test or standard to them because they're going to sit on the board. Or, as is being suggested, you can look at deputy governors, but bear in mind that those are appointed by the board. How far do you want to, what is the utility of imposing a specific statutory standard to who the board should employ, as opposed to requiring, I think the point of principle that had been suggested, I thought, from Member Golding, to establish a principle of the standard that the bank members should achieve, but leave the board as responsible for all of that as they are today. If the bank was employing criminals, it's answerable, or I shouldn't say that perhaps here, but employing people who aren't fit or suitable, the board is answerable for that and should be. And I'm not sure if a statutory test should relieve them of any responsibility. Somebody meets the statutory test but really shouldn't be appointed anyway, for example.
Sorry, I understand it to be asking Parliament to give you, not you personal governor, but to give the bank some freedom to do things in an independent way. And my concern is that whatever they do after the Parliament, give them that freedom. We, the parliamentarians, are going to be held responsible for. I don't want to get into the trouble you almost got into yesterday, right? But essential to give you a certain liberty. Then we must demand that the people who are going to make the appointment do so under strict terms to protect the people. I'm fearful. I've been living in a world of the Sandifords and the Madoff and the, I don't want to call them Jamaican, I can't remember them. I don't want to go to Sanford. But I just want to make sure. You think I was going to say another Smith? I don't want that. I want to make sure that when I say yeah to this bill, that I know that Jamaican people are protected, right? And that's where I'm coming from, because you're asking us to give you a certain degree of freedom. Autonomy. Me call it freedom for them, know what I'm saying?
Yeah, if I may, Chair, I think the people that are being given the freedom that you're speaking of, the member is speaking of, we have to keep clear that this is the board. That's who is being given this. For the staff of the bank, there is no change. They're working for whoever gives them instructions, orders, and so forth, and they have to operate under a proper regime of human resource manual, standards, ethics, etc. Those are all proper things that the bank has to meet that standard, and the Parliament and others would have the right and should oversee that and require that that's there. So I don't want to be suggesting, Chair, that I'm objecting. As I said a little earlier, I think the principle that Member Golding had mentioned, if that's the same thing that you're speaking about, and it's a question of how to apply it here so that objective is met, I don't think there's any basis for a disagreement. I think it's a question of how. As I'd committed, I would look at where, what are the other approaches and get the information for the member on how does that work elsewhere, and then perhaps you could form a view there.
Yes, just very quickly to address a point that was made by Member Bunting in terms of the continuous nature of the assessment of fit and proper status. To note that for the board members, the appointed board members, that will come under, or that comes under the schedule to the Act, which speaks about the persons not being appointed or remaining a director if they do not satisfy certain conditions, one of which is fit and proper. So that would address that point of yours.
Yes and no. Yes and no. It's a ground of revocation if they cease to meet it. But the question is, should they have to go through a process of refreshing that, which might bring it to
how would you discover it?
So,
how would you discover it? This is why I'm saying you need periodic assessment, evaluation, so that if they no longer met it, it will be discovered.
So, understood. So that's, as Governor said, is a procedural matter which may or may not fall in the statute, but that's a procedure that would support that requirement, because how are you going to know if they're not unless you're looking at it?
The point had been raised back when this was amended.
And it was, sorry.
2004.
Yes. Yes. And just
I think that's fair, but I'm just wondering, if you have it in the statute like that, then the practice is the only way to make sure that you are conforming to the statute is to have a regular test, whether that test is every 3, every 2, every whatever. every 5. Yeah, I think that's what the practice is going to be.
To fall under the governance standards of the bank,
Yes.
which is what we're elevating and requiring that the bank, generate through these independent
Just
members.
out of interest, is it for the private sector, then the regulated private sector, the fit and proper test is done once, is that right? Or is it
Invite more
repeated?
Deputy Governor
isn't it?
Sims maybe could give an answer to
Yeah,
that.
I am.
I think you're feeling some heat here, Governor. I mean, I think, how many of us have been subjected to that? I've certainly been on many, many occasions. Oh, what joy it is. So we're just sharing the joy, that's all.
The bank appreciates this.
Payback time.
And this remember, the bank will also have to focus on customer satisfaction.
Yes.
And so finding the ways to make this something that is, take as much pain out of it as you can, but nevertheless make sure, because I think anybody who goes through it does not want to discover that some other entity doesn't, and therefore, and we've seen systems, the reason these exist is that you've seen systems undermined by, extraordinary stories of individuals. There's a case in Australia, for example, where they had a meltdown of an insurance area many years ago. And when the dust settled and the inquiry and so on happened, it turned out the individual who led it into the pit was wanted, was a wanted felon or something like that from the U.S. They just somehow they didn't have the standard to check, and it actually has happened. It's not, these things exist because of examples where the error has been made. That doesn't mean that they're perfect, and therefore reviewing how they work and who they exclude. The point made by the member, I recall my colleagues at the FSC had considered that question of, for example, if you were not fit and proper 20 years ago, 20 years later, can you become fit and proper despite some of these disqualifications? And I believe their answer was yes. We have to look at you and look at the facts at each point and make a judgment, because these rules are about the protection of the customer. That's why they're there. They're not there for any other reason.
Okay, I would like to.
I was just going to answer the question. How often is it the test done? Is it?
And on the licensee itself to ensure that the persons that they're engaging continues to be fit and proper. And we do an official refresh every 5 years.
And sorry, just to mention that the same applies in relation to the MPC and FPC in terms of there is an ability to revoke if they are no longer fit and proper, and the same considerations would apply.
Okay, so we do have some work to do to come back on some of the points, but the consensus is that we apply the fit and proper criteria in this section to as yet undefined persons in the bank. My preference would be to do with deputy governor on up, because there's some permanence to that. When you go into director and the structure of the bank, there'll always be a governor of the bank, and by definition always be deputy governors. There'll be a director or executive director, or below that the structure can change over time, so it's hard to codify. And the way in which I think the Bank of Jamaica or central bank is structured, the big decisions are really with those people. Decisions. A lot of people do a lot of work, but in terms of the decisions are with those 7. Yeah. So I think that's what I would sort of suggest, but we don't have to finalize it now. We can bring it back and move on.
And Chairman, on that point, I'm just wondering if, as the lawyers would say, if this is a convenient time, because there's a lot of work to be done. And,
What you saying?
No, what I'm saying, as the lawyers would say elsewhere, this may be a convenient point. Well, they don't usually go all the way. They just simply code it. Given all the work to be done and the follow-up, and given some of the things that we're just receiving today, whether or not we could usefully go much further this afternoon a period of reflection on what we have gotten may very well be useful. No, the traffic is late, right? But it may be a convenient point. Regardless.
I think we're just starting, Senator. Come on. I mean, the first thing is that, you want to go 1, 2, 3, go. We're not even at the 3 yet, let alone go. So I would, the afternoon is young. Let's just press on.
Maybe you could indicate to us how much longer you want to be.
I was suggesting an hour from now, 5:30.
5:30?
Yes.
There's no staff in the parliament who may have been extended by yourself and others.
Remember Bunting made his vote at 8 o'clock last night?
I know that's the point I'm making. Having been extended. Was it yesterday?
Same staff?
So? Maybe you could.
Yeah, it's true.
Chairman, I think there was merit to the Saturday meetings as they were being held as opposed to the midweek ones, because some of these issues require such extensive deliberation. For me personally, I don't know how the other members feel about it.
I got so much heat for that. I want to get some support, and
they seem more amicable at this
But is it logic, right? Yes. Okay, you need long stretches of time. But Senator Brown, 1 hour from now. Let's see? All right. Okay. So, Section 2B on the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, where it says the provisions of the PBMA shall not apply to this act. And we started discussion on that earlier. Yes.
Close are we on
2B. Page 5, top of page 5. 2B of the bill. Yeah. Where we're saying this amendment, we would say that the PBMA does not apply to the BOJ Act as amended. The reasons being what we discussed earlier, that the PBMA Act is frequently updated, has provisions that are not that are looser than we would want for the BOJ in some instances, and in other instances has provisions that should not apply. We would have regulations that are specific to the BOJ, which would incorporate all the things that we wanted to apply. And let's just go through like some of the things that were in Member Golden's comments about what he was suggesting ought to be in those rules, and get the BOJ's response, right? So in my view, if the things that we are concerned about are included in the regulations, then it would just give us the advantage of specificity for the BOJ, which is, has a lot of advantages. Right? Because it means we can go tighter on certain things.
Right, but if they go tighter, then they would automatically comply with the PBMA. Because
yes, but it's just that the PBMA has a lot of other things that, as the example, one simple example given earlier was, just the time that you have to report, some of the nuances involved in procuring currency, right, and things like that. And you want just to have specific regulations to have the general regulations that apply to the procuring of staples, to the procuring of currency, as an example. So we just want to be specific.
Well, why would you not have just a statement in the specific regulations that said where it's in conflict with the PBMA, then this would take precedence? But why would you need, I still don't see why you need a general exemption if there is something that in your specific regulation which is in conflict. I don't know if that could be one way of treating.
Just how would you determine and identify those that are in conflict clearly?
Well, the people who have an issue, they must identify it.
Yeah.
But
I mean, they've been functioning for a while. with the PBMA in existence.
And functioning with contradictions and things, just
right.
like
So
the things that we talk about all the time.
I don't think it's beyond those who feel there are contradictions to point out what they are and say that those provisions should not apply or should apply as modified as follows or something.
But it's just that going forward, it's likely, because the PBMA is something that we update all the time, just to be very, to have regulations that are specific to the BOJ.
Yeah. I mean,
potentially hold them to.
From my point of view, I'm not worried or proposing even that the PBMA in its entirety should apply. That's not where I'm. What I feel is that there are some important provisions in it that should apply.
And we are aligned on that.
Yeah, and I'm just not sure whether putting it in regulations is a satisfactory way of doing it, because regulations can change. Regulations are not always that easy to even find in the laws of Jamaica. If you look you try and find regulations in this parliament right now that have been made under those statutes, and I can tell you're not going to have an easy time. So, there are reasons, and I may not have even thought through all of them now, why the fundamental ones, which are about really ensuring that if something is going terribly wrong in this independent central bank, there is a mechanism for dealing with it, and it's not just relying on Parliament to amend the Act or something, but there are some residual accountability buffers or accountability insurances legislatively that continue to give that protection. That's all I am saying. And then maybe I may have identified some that are covered in other ways, or that they feel are, these are the ideas that occurred to me when I was combing through the PBMA to do this particular paper. But these are important issues. So, yeah.
So you want to just go through General Counsel on the regulations that is on page 3. Right, and it's on page 3 of this. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, why don't we proceed by asking the Bank of Jamaica to explain why these provisions, which Member Golding thinks are critical, explain why they need to be exempt from these.
No, I think that we'll find on most of these we'll find agreement. I mean, so can you just say that in your own words?
To assert your independence.
Chair and members, what I could do is just to point out some of the conflicts that we have identified. Perhaps that might.
First of all, start with the suggestions from Member Golding on the parts of the PBMA that should apply. Do you disagree with any of them? Procurement. I don't think you do it, with the exception of the currency and
the notes and.
Huh?
Okay.
And even that, I'm not sure.
All right. So we could perhaps address the matter of procurement. We can look at wages, and we can look at some accountability provisions. And we would say that under the PBMA, as we know, all public bodies are governed by the procurement rules and guidelines. The draft regulations that we think would factor in and would ensure that the bank will continue to adhere to those procurement guidelines, save and except in relation to the notes and coins, procurement of notes and coins, which I believe is already exempt, and by the NCC, right? And implementation of monetary policy through financial contracts. So, except for certain matters which, by the nature of the bank's, the role that the bank plays, then those would be exempt from those provisions. In relation to item 2 under the 5.3 of the PBMA, there is already in place an exemption, as we had mentioned, of the Bank of Jamaica in relation to the exercise of borrowing powers in relation to issue of bonds. In relation to wages, the proposal that we think would be included in the draft regulations would be that they, bearing in mind the position of the bank and the considerations to do it, retaining and attracting qualified staff in keeping with the Basel core principles and other provisions in terms of effective banking supervision, what is proposed is that the bank's board would have the ability to ensure that it has the necessary guidelines in place to allow for the retaining and the attracting of those staff. However, if it is that the bank's position should vary from the position of the wages guidelines, then reference would be made to the minister in relation to that point. You want to add anything, Governor? Consultation with the minister. You want to add anything, Governor? No. In terms of accountability, the regulations would include provisions that retain key elements of PBMA while taking into account provisions of the Bank of Jamaica Act and objectives and provisions in the bill. The regulations would include the provision of the PBMA for the financial secretary to be able to request information from the bank on its financial operations. It would include the conduct by the Auditor General of special audits on the accounts and operational efficiencies of the bank. So the Auditor General would be able to have access to the bank and its accounting and other records.
Why don't you just can you respond to the specific proposal? Yeah. So, for example, the Section 8.4 of the PBMA, the external audit of the BOJ shall be entitled to be given notice of and attend every meeting of the directors or the audit committee in relation to matters covering the auditor's functions or on which the auditor has made a report, and shall attend such meetings when requested by the directors or audit committee. Did you consider these specific?
Yeah, we did. Chairman, I just would need to bring that up if you like, or I could just ask you to stand that down. Let me find that.
I'm just saying, Mr. Chairman, what we're trying to say is, given that the direction we're moving with the independence of the bank, you want to ensure that you have good checks and balances. So we're all in agreement. And I think now what has happened is that they've taken out the PBMA. In doing so, we feel there's some issues that could have been left in just to keep it as tight as possible. I think Member Golden had made a list. I think the best thing they could do is just give us at the next meeting a list of those they have no problems with, and the ones where they have problems.
What are they proposing?
What are they proposing, or if there's a fundamental problem with it, but give out, and then we can debate that, and just let the ones that we agree with, and they find a way to incorporate it into what we're doing.
I agree.
And just to add to that, they might identify others to which they want to recommend.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I agree. I don't think we have any substantive kind of differences here. The BOJ has already started to think about those draft regulations, and it includes Auditor General and the auditors and all of those things. But so I think the best form to give everybody comfort is just to respond to the specifics and just, each item.
Show what applies, show what doesn't apply, and show what is going to be incorporated in regs.
Or you can say, look, this is how we would word it. So it's worded this way in the external auditor provisions are worded this way in 8.4. The way is proposed to be worded in the regulations is as follows. It covers the same thing, and it's probably even tighter.
Yeah, but Mr. Chairman, I would prefer, let's start from the assumption that the provisions of the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act shall apply with these exceptions. I would prefer it.
Is that
May I come, Chair? I think
these sections will not apply, rather than the whole act will not apply.
I think that that is one of those drafting questions as to what's the best way to achieve it, right? But secondly, there is the issue of how do we address the risk, as I alluded to a little earlier. There was a time, a few years back, when the Parliament changed the law to require that there shall be ministerial approval for every borrowing. I'm not going into for borrowing by any public body. If we had been at this stage of the market we are now, then you would potentially have an immediate problem in your financial markets.
But that should never have applied to the BOJ, and that whenever that amendment was done, and I'm not even sure exactly how it was done, but that should not have applied to the BOJ, and if it was an oversight if that exclusion wasn't included. But I don't think we should use the fact that an error may occur when future legislation is being drafted as grounds for saying these fundamental provisions which are in the PBMA should not apply and should be something else similar should be tucked into regulations made under the BOJ Act. What is the provision about in the principal statute about the making of regulations? Who makes them? Who has to approve them?
So the proposal in this case is that these regulations, governance regulations, will be made by the.
I don't see any provision in the bill on that.
By the bank with the approval of the minister, if I may, with approval of the minister and subject to affirmative resolution. Yeah. But if I could just make the point, it's not to. I said there's a drafting issue and then there's a second issue. To the member. To Member Golding's point, the issue relating to that amendment to the Act was remedied once identified. Several months later was remedied. I think that this is not the only time that amendments have been made to statutes for other purposes that then impact in some way the central bank. So the question really is there a mechanism or an approach that can preserve the decision making by Parliament, etc., but nevertheless help to keep it all in one place so that you can see exactly what you're changing with respect to the central bank. Indeed, there may be times when you need to change something and make it, as the chairman pointed out, tighter than the PBMA, as things evolve, as standards evolve. And so, to Member Bunting's point, we've identified all of the provisions of the PBMA, and where there's an issue, we will identify what the issue is, where the conflict is, and where it's proposed that there's no issue, we can identify what the proposed term would be. I'm not here, Member Golding, seeking to contradict your point. I'm just explaining the structure of what's being proposed, so that whichever choice is made, a key point is that the provisions that need to be there to maintain the standard of the PBMA are applied to, that they're there in the law, and the ones that shouldn't be are removed, and that a mechanism is identified that can assist in maximizing the likelihood of keeping the standard up at the bank and not creating conflicts. I think those issues, I'm not trying to enter the debate with you, Member Golding, about whether to do it this way or not, but just to explain how this should work. So we can be sure, Chair, that we present a listing that shows comprehensively PBMA issues, what's proposed, so that can be addressed, and then the other issue of structure we can leave.
And Chairman, I just want to make one point quickly, which is that I'm not aware of any public body to which the PBMA does not apply at all, right? And if we do it this way, we're creating a precedent which others are going to want to follow as well. Everybody would love that. Let's not apply it just because there's some things in it which are inconvenient or inconsistent with how we'd like to operate. And I'm just wary of setting that precedent.
The central bank is indeed, not by excuse or construction, and especially the central bank that we are modernizing here to be an independent central bank, that it is a special creature and may need specific regulations that are tighter probably than elsewhere.
I accept that there are elements of what it does that make it unique. I think there are also elements of its operations which are in common with other public bodies. And a lot of the issues that I've highlighted there are really not focused on or touching or impacted by the uniqueness of the central bank. The question really is, how do you have in law provide for these provisions. That's the
So
real issue.
That's what I'm saying. That
Yeah.
I think that we are at one with trying to construct a manner for these to apply to the central bank.
Right.
That we're at one, and I want them to confirm in their own words by putting the schedule and saying exactly how they would do it. Right? That we're in agreement on. I would just advocate that we have something for them specific, so we are absolutely clear. That is what.
You know, if there's a provision in the PBM that's not tight enough, not robust enough, I think we should exclude its application and put the more robust one in the bill or in the regulations. But for many of them, I think, are probably adequately expressed in the PBMA now. I mean, unless you, so I'm not sure.
Chairman, as I understand, one example is that the PBMA require report from public bodies 4 months. BOJ is at 3 months. So they are in compliance. And there's nothing to say you can't do better than the PMBA, right? PBMA. So that for me, once you open the floodgate, you open the gate and say, well, one can run out. We're going to have a problem. I want higher standards too, and we say if we must amend the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act to say public bodies can exceed the requirement. In other words, you can come in 3 months. You don't have to come in 4 months. So, in other words, that's one that you use.
But just as an example, it's a bit of a trivial one. I'm sorry to have brought it up. I brought it up because it's a sort of an easy one. But the truth is, with the statutory, we're creatures of statute. You can't leave an ambiguity. You have to specify. We have to be clear. That one is an easy one.
The office of the CPC has been dying to come in. Sorry, I've been
May I just suggest, Chair, since we have prepared the regulations and they're at an advanced stage, and we've checked it based on Member Golding's the comments that he's raised, and all of them are there. Can we then just insert it as a schedule? No, as a schedule to the actual bill. So when we do. And then you put a provision probably saying that the minister could amend that schedule by order rather than have it to come back, subject to affirmative resolution, rather than have it to come back to any amendments. But it will be there, the regulations will be attached. Yes, it will be part of the act. Yes, as a schedule.
Just with maybe if I could just add, just to preserve the role of the board of the bank in the recommendation of those. I think that's a part of the provision. So that could apply, yeah.
Can we circulate that?
We can, I think we can circulate as a schedule, yes.
So, Minister, I'm wondering if the work of just identifying what the provisions are, which would have those in it.
All of them are there, because I checked it, yes. All of them
exactly.
are there.
That's how it was prepared.
Yes.
So everything is covered, and you can see what's not covered. We can either circulate that or do a separate schedule that shows everything that's excluded, and then the members can... Or do both, actually. Yeah, perhaps we could do both. Mrs. Chinqui has found the section we were looking for. So if you wanted her to start going through some of the items that were included, that were in Member Golding's, Section 6, sections, etc.
I'd prefer it written.
Okay, fine.
The people can refer to and see directly.
Much better. Yeah.
All right. Just have sort of 39 minutes left. I lost my bill here. Where is it? Okay. All right, moving on to Clause 4. Which talks about mandate.
It's now out of date because you're down at 1.25. Is that right? The policy rate is now 1.25. Yeah, you see. My comment said it's 2% per annum.
Oh, yes.
All right, so, Section 5, which deals with the mandate of the bank. I think we have a comment from Member Golding that wanted to include a section, subsection 2H, that had to influence the volume and conditions of supply of credit so as to promote the fullest expansion of investment, employment, and economic growth that is consistent with the objective of maintaining price stability in Jamaica through achieving the inflation target.
Functions, right? Because you have here, this is
the functions, yeah.
Yeah. So 5.1 sets out the principal object of inflation targeting and the sort of subordinate principle of financial system stability, and then 2 sets out a number of functions of the bank and so on.
Right.
Yeah. Inflation targeting started in New Zealand, I believe it, yes, and we're a developing country and all that, so I'm just kind of a little wary of having nothing in it about growth and employment and so on,
right,
in a way that's consistent with the inflation target.
So if we do it, we're not going to have the inflation target, and in our particular way that we're doing it kind of cautiously by retaining the ability to set the inflation target in the executive, right? So in other central banks that are independent, they set inflation target and they pursue it. And so yes, because they're doing that, they have to deal with the trade-off between inflation, employment, and growth. So in other words, a particular inflation target can have different impacts on employment and growth and so forth. By retaining that ability to set the target on the executive side, any trade-off the executive is going to have to be responsible for. After they have proven themselves, and after Jamaica is more mature, more developed, we could look at transferring everything to them, in which case being also responsible for having the functions include what you're suggesting would make more sense at that stage. Having it here with inflation target, it lets them off the hook. Because, and certainly lets the minister off the hook. Because he has the minister will have the double thing of being able to set the inflation target, anything he wants it to be, and then blame the central bank if unemployment or growth outcomes are not.
But the proposed H is really talking about the bank, one of its functions being influencing the volume and conditions of supply of credit, and for a particular purpose, which is to promote the fullest expansion of investment, employment, and economic growth that is consistent with the objective of maintaining price stability in Jamaica through achieving the inflation target set pursuant to Section 34 FF. It's really focusing on, as one of their functions, influencing the volume and conditions of supply of credit. And what we have is this monetary easing down to 1.25. It's lower than the Fed, and trying to get the economy going and so on. And that is, I think, a role that they ought to be playing. The problem is that the credit transmission system isn't very efficient, but so it's not easy to do, or it takes time, or whatever it may be. But dealing with the volume and conditions of supply of credit as being one of their functions, and for the purpose of supporting a robust economy that is consistent with the minister's target. That's what I'm saying.
All right. So I mean, I have a suggestion of how we can sort of kind of find a compromise on it. The monetary policy decisions are going to respond to price outcomes, right? When prices consistently come out lower than expected, then you end up with monetary easing. We totally change a construct if we word it in the way you're having it here. And the point of monetary transmission in Jamaica being problematic is acknowledged, but we have to use other tools to address it. Doing this in this way is kind of a blunt instrument. I mean, monetary transmission in Jamaica is difficult because we have huge cash reserve ratios and liquidity. We're using things that are for liquidity for prudential purposes, rather than using liquidity tools for monetary purposes.
Or the other way around, we're using prudential tools for liquidity purposes.
That's why I closed my eyes. I was getting it right.
I just say somewhat confused because the laws that set these up were done in a different era. You don't use them that way now, and that's what this will clear up.
Yeah.
May I make a comment? Transmission issue that was raised, recognizing that there are problems with the transmission, just to clarify that what that means from an inflation targeting point of view, from our operational point of view, is that the amount of change we have to make in the policy signal has to be more for the effect that we want. That's essentially what a transmission clogging means.
Or it may not happen at all. If it's too clogged.
Yes, if it never happens, then you have a different problem. But Jamaica does have a transmission. The state of the transmission, we are told by external experts, is actually consistent with the development of our market. We have to improve it, and we will. But what that will change is that, the quarter point you see that the Fed Reserve does, and we try to copy them a bit, achieves a lot. Our quarter point achieves less. We have to move by more and make more steps.
So this regime, came out in New Zealand, a developed country. It's been applied in a lot of developing countries and so on. We are a country with a GDP per capita of about 5,000 US. We're not even top in our region. We're way down, and we're going to a system which is saying, central bank, it's all about that. And we're accepting that. That's what this is about,
No, I think we can come some ways to I'm going to suggest some language, right, to address. But remember, we're not doing what they're doing, right? Because what they're doing, those countries, their central bank has the responsibility of the target.
Well, I'm not sure that's true in every instance. I did some research on it, and I don't think.
No, I'm saying the majority of them do.
Yeah, but I don't.
So the ones that we're alluding to, New Zealand.
Or the target has been, either they have the responsibility or the target is set through constitution or something, but the political system can't change.
Canada, I think, it's not just in turn the bank itself that sets inflation target. Right. There's a process for it. Yeah.
Right. So the question of how much discretion you want the bank to have on issues of growth, which means that the minister loses that discretion, so to speak, because the bank, unelected, I think the point was made, unelected officials will then be determining essentially welfare distribution issues. And that's what you're trying to squeeze out of, remove from the central bank as you make it more autonomous, so that the responsibility, if the minister says, look, I want more growth and therefore I'll accept more inflation, you make that decision, the bank will have to follow that. As opposed to the bank saying, I'm going to be a little tighter or a little looser because I decided we would like a bit more growth, whereas the political system might say, well, growth for whom? Yeah. Because implicit in this issue of inflation is that and growth is that there's a sort of a distributional effect within society and groups that we want to be sure in these proposals that there is no ambiguity about where that responsibility lies, that the unelected officials that we're creating and making independent have no such responsibility. They have to be accountable for the inflation target. And then how wording can capture the idea that you don't want, where there is an opportunity that we walk in lockstep and refuse to do developmental work and so on.
What about the volume and conditions of supply of credit? Yeah.
So we don't have those. We moved away from that because, in a sense, we're not. While we are actually in practice affecting the volumes and condition of supply of credit, it's not only that. We're impacting financial markets through the interest rates. We're impacting money markets. We're impacting housing markets and so forth. So the formulation has moved away from that specific item of controlling credit.
There's nothing in here whatsoever about that. Anyway,
through you, Chair. If we look at the inflation target that we want to have, and then its effect depends on the transmission mechanism. So do we have the capacity or the capability to include within whatever legislative process or whatever we do to address the monetary transmission mechanism directly, to say, okay, this could go this way or that way, and then if not, how we increase competition among banks to allow the mechanism to flow more fluently. Secondly, remember, currently, the central bank has many functions. Prior, when Jamaica had no fiscal room, the central bank has a role to play in terms of stimulating output, unemployment, and maintaining stability in the economy. Do we now lose this role or relegate it now to it being achieved solely through an inflation target?
What role being achieved through inflation target?
The other roles that it must complement fiscal policy. For example, if the government wants to achieve a particular amount of output increase and it makes a movement in fiscal policy, it will affect other variables, then central bank now must adjust its interest rate so that it does not affect this or that whenever the fiscal policy moves out. So is this now being relegated solely to a particular inflation target that is not guaranteed?
Yes.
Okay, so on the first question with the monetary transmission, the government has to take responsibility for that, and our problems with monetary transmission have been built up over a long period of time. Government policy has to be directed towards increasing it. Some of the impediments for the lack of transmission in the monetary channel include things like the taxes that the government has imposed on the financial institutions, right? It includes the fact that because of the kind of fiscal dominance that has existed, the central bank has had to, hasn't had the scope and the capacity to use open market operations for monetary policy, and is using these crude instruments. The more that fiscal is more responsible, as we have been now for several years, and provided the bank has enough capital, the greater the scope for the bank to use open market operations to conduct monetary policy. So if the government does what it's supposed to do, we will see improvements in the transmission. And indeed, we are better off today than we were at X period in the past as far as transmission is. We have a long way to go, but it really falls for government to do.
So looking at the BOJ, for example, we move rates, say, from 2.5 to 2%, and commercial banks don't respond. And then we move rates from 2% to 1.75%, commercial banks don't respond. We move from 1.75 to 1.5. Is there something in place to say, okay, we have to wait on commercial banks' response after a particular X amount of basis points before we can move X amount of basis points, or do we just keep on moving irrespective of the response?
So, I mean, that is a very good question. It is one of the questions of our time, so to speak. It's not that commercial banks aren't moving, they are moving, but what we're seeing two things. They're probably not moving fast enough from our perspective, our mean in society. And the movement is occurring at the higher credit quality end. At the lower credit quality end, the movement is stubborn. Some of the reasons for that have to do with information asymmetry, right? And it definitely competition, and have to do with ensuring that, and that is why the Microcredit Act and the Credit Union Bill and all these companion measures are very important, because they service a lot of that market as well. And, they have to be brought into the kind of envelope. But it's one of the key reasons which you can't get away from as a society is the fact that we impose taxes on every additional asset that they acquire. So we are saying to them, you lend money to the lower credit customer, and you're going to pay a percentage of that loan as tax. Which means...
If you're just substituting one asset for another, how would that, if you're just substituting one asset for another, in other words, if instead of holding securities, they're inclined to try and improve their yields by lending to borrowers with less credit quality, shouldn't it affect their taxable position, should it, on the asset tax side?
No, I'm just saying that they're going to demand a higher rate to,
For the credit risk.
For the credit risk, but you're saying the higher rate is uniform across assets.
Yeah, I'm just saying the asset tax is fairly ambivalent as to the nature of the assets held. So I'm just saying if banks were disposed to hunt yield or grow their loan book more aggressively, the asset tax ought not to be an impediment to that insofar as those
it's an impediment to the rate. To the rate that is
overall,
charged.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. So that's something that we have to be able to do, but we have to get over the politics of it all as well, right? I mean, you go and reduce the asset tax for banks, and then the politics of it all, the real reason...
There was a commitment given to them?
There's a commitment given to them, exactly. Right? So, I mean, I hope when we do it, we can get your support, because it... So on the second part of your question, Senator Houghton, because the executive is retaining the ability to set the target, which you can tell all of us is a very impactful thing, right? Setting an inflation target of 5%, will it achieve a very different set of monetary policy decisions than an inflation target of 2% or than an inflation target of 8%. So the government is pursuing a certain fiscal path and has an idea or has of what it wants on growth and on employment, what it's the trade-offs that it's willing to accept as the elected representatives, and it sets an inflation target that's consistent with those. And given conditions that prevail at any time, once an inflation target is set and the inflation outcomes are known, I think the path is fairly predictable. Yeah. So by retaining the ability to set the inflation target, the government retains a lot of the ability of the people to look to the government remains in large part.
For example, cash reserve and liquid asset ratios, which are prudential ratios originally, but are used for liquidity management purposes or have been, in terms of how the central bank approaches that, and those can affect the volume and supply of credit in the marketplace, and the conditions of supply, if to the extent that there is an enabling provision as one of their functions to look at the overall system and how credit is provided in the economy, and as long as they are doing this in a way that is consistent with achieving their target, they should be seeking to influence the volume and conditions of credit.
Having those words in there, Senator Golding, takes away from inflation.
So here's what I'm not married to the words.
So here's what I was suggesting something like this in recognition of the point that you mentioned, and I haven't even run it by the bank yet.
Run it by them first.
Huh?
Run it by them first. We'll wait till next time to hear that.
Okay,
yeah,
right.
Better you'll get there.
So just to respond, but it's just that those words take away. But we're going to acknowledge the thing and find a way to incorporate that does not take away from what we're trying to achieve, the overall scheme.
There's just one question I have for the governor under the functions. The governor, I believe you were deputy governor in charge of market operations in 2003.
Oh no, this sounds like a revenge question, boy.
I'm afraid I wasn't.
You in 2003 you weren't at Bank of Jamaica?
I think you were. Not to my best recollection.
When did you leave? I'm pretty sure you were.
We began this meeting talking about my departure. Now we're into my resume. I mean, I just would like some protection of the chair.
He's a man of many departures, so he shall
What's
return.
going on? But no, I was I left BOJ in '99.
In '99,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So, but you may be aware, I think you were at FSC at the time. That's correct. But I remember you were in the regulatory system.
Gestapo tactics.
In 2003, when we had that very sharp increase in the BOJ rate from 18 to 36, I think it was overnight, and it precipitated a liquidity crisis in the system, and a lot of revaluation of the currency with a liquidity crisis for the players. And I remember at the time there was no sort of lender of last resort or no source of liquidity for the securities dealers, as the banks withdrew their liquidity from the dealers to protect their own, to protect themselves. Then it exposed that even though the dealers probably in aggregate controlled more assets than the banks at the time anyway, and I think it might still be so today, there was no sort of equivalent of a lender of last resort or a liquidity window, a guaranteed liquidity window for the main makers of the market. And when the Securities Dealers Association or representatives at the time met with the bank, the Bank of Jamaica, I mean, while I recall the FSC being sympathetic, but they didn't, of course, have any balance sheet to help. And when they went to Bank of Jamaica, well, our hands are tied because the Act only allows us to be that banker or lender of last resort for deposit-taking institutions. Now, to my mind, the broader object of financial system stability should allow for some function of the bank in such a situation to be able to step in and intervene beyond just deposit-taking institutions. And this seems to be written too narrowly to me.
About G.
Yes. Or if there was any other two letter. Yeah.
It would say
G or an F. I mean,
not necessarily as banker, but we might have another paragraph.
Right, as somehow providing liquidity. In other words, you could do repurchase agreements with government securities, for example. They could provide liquidity in that way. But there was no mandate for the central bank to do that, even though this was very important to the stability of the financial system. And I don't know if there's been any, I've not really been on the executive side of the business for a long time, so I don't know if there's any more recent occurrences of that kind of liquidity crunches, but I remember at the time the system was very close to the edge, and it seemed to have been 2008 again. That's right. And so, all I'm saying is I don't think we should define a role so narrowly, or the functions rather, as it's the way it's divided here, because in order to achieve the object of financial system stability, it might require more flexibility on the side of how we define the functions to allow some liquidity to be provided outside of just deposit-taking institutions.
Thank you. The provisions relating to financial stability that had been implemented in the amendments in 2015, included some provisions related to sort of emergency liquidity assistance, and in these amendments, in these amendments, there is actually something to tweak it a bit further. What page is this?
Page here.
On page 24. On page 24 of the bill. On page 24 of the bill, at section 16, clause 16, which I know we'll get to in the clause by clause. Minister, but just since it's raised here, that this does make it clearer that the bank can provide emergency liquidity assistance to financial institutions. And financial institutions are entities that provide financial services as per the Banking Services Act, which includes the kind of activities that the entities that you mentioned would be involved with. Now, admittedly, this is emergency liquidity assistance, so it's not sort of course of business, but this is a part of that lender of last resort, trying to make sure, as the various amendments have been made, the FinStab amendments in 2015, and as we go forward, making sure that in those sort of situations of stress and crisis, that there are means for appropriate assistance to be provided under proper terms, without creating the moral hazard, of course, of opening the door to central bank money to entities that don't have to meet or are not being supervised by the central bank. So it's finding that balance.
Usually it's priced to discourage that, as I recall.
Well, sometimes. I mean, even now we have some practice which we'd implemented during the course of these last reforms over the last 6 years or so, to make sure that in the course of it, if there was a crisis, we were able to do something, so we wouldn't have a problem of the nature that you were worrying about.
What
and what we found is that there was no,
the
entities did not want to meet, they've been slow to put together what was required for the same reason that the things we require, they're too tough, perhaps. So we want to make it a bit more orderly, a bit clearer, so that everybody knows. We have to deal with issues of potential stigma, so that you don't find that somebody doesn't access when they could because of the stigma issues. There are a lot of issues around this that
just remind us of the definition of financial institution. What does it mean in the BOJ Act now?
It means, Karen? Financial institution means what?
In the Principal Act.
Under this Act?
As amended.
Can I just tell you the short version is that it has the meaning under the BSA. And under the BSA, financial institution means a person who undertakes or engages in financial services. Financial services under the BSA are, and it has a list of A through N, banking business, lending, consumer credit, financing commercial transactions, transfer of money or value, issuing electronic money, financial guarantees and commitments, dealing in securities and trading in other financial instruments, participation in security issues, individual and collective portfolio management, insurance business and insurance-related financial services, investment of monies and other financial assets on behalf of third parties, pension fund management, and any other service designated as a financial service by the supervisor by order published in the Gazette, subject to affirmative resolution.
Buried deep in the banking services and the Banking Act somewhere are the powers, but it's not really identified as a function. So could I suggest for your consideration then, perhaps an H, 2H, that could say something to the effect of providing emergency liquidity assistance to financial institutions?
I mean, I think is there a reason to elevate that one over other things that we're required to do?
Because I think that is critically important for financial stability.
Yeah.
So perhaps it's a look at the financial stability amendments that specify the mandate to ensure financial stability. I would need to take a look at that perhaps to then maybe give you feedback on this. I would be cautious about adding.
If you want to make it more generally, rather than say emergency liquidity assistance, say something to the effect of whatever any actions necessary to promote financial stability. Then,
if you'd allow me to maybe,
it must be a function. If you have it as an object, then it should have some.
Could we take a look? If just give me a little while to take a look at in the financial stability amendments, just to see what Parliament had put there.
I'm not trying to draft it here,
but it may cover what
I'm just saying what I'm trying to achieve. So
it's one thing to have the powers, but how do the powers relate to the object?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you have the powers to do those transactions to provide liquidity, but
But when institutions...
But you might, you might be minded in a particular way as to how you approach that, and another government
might say this is not in a function.
Yeah, let it crash.
Let it crash, it's not in a function.
Yeah, and then Nigel picks up the tab, or me. You know.
We would need to do a little bit of research just to see, so we can pull together the elements related to
for the things that are in the financial stability responsibility of the bank.
Yeah, and I think the members, speaking of lender of last resort function, how best should that be identified?
Yeah. But if it's even something as generic as utilize the powers under part whatever of the Act in furtherance of subsection 1 or something, it could...
I think that the example that was there is a
subsection 4. Sorry,
but it's not listed as a function.
There's obviously
it's not listed as a function.
It shall carry out its functions
to achieve the objectives.
But it's not a function. So how can it carry it out if it's not a function?
Yeah. It's not
you need to add it as a function, and then you can carry it out.
Yeah.
So the specific provisions, 23 deals with what the bank can lend and how it should lend. That's 23, I think, section 23 and 24 deals with those. And then what was done was to implement in the FinStab amendment some elements to widen that so that the bank can be looking outside of just licensees, but in that envelope, which is very much not ordinary course of business. Let me leave that there.
Different governors can have different attitudes, and if it's not in there as a function, even though they may have the power, then it will be just left to their discretion whether or not to exercise it. But
I don't think I have discretion because it's not a function.
Exactly, or they may say I may have the power but not the discretion.
I think I want to make sure I'm understanding. Is it that the sense is that without having it expressed as a function, the lender of the last resort function is sort of legislatively or statutorily there's a deficiency? Is that the point that we need to remedy? I'm just trying to make sure
there should be a seamless stream from the objects to the functions to the powers in the Act.
Lender of last resort in order to promote financial system stability.
And I'm not
I would want to take some advice on that because you embed commitments to lend.
Yeah, this is something
that language may not be the language to use, or lender of last resort.
You already have banker to deposit taking institution, so that is the lender of last resort. There.
That's not lending per se, banker is.
Well, banker, but it includes lending. If you're a banker, it includes lending.
Not necessarily, no.
Deposits as well. Deposits as well. I mean, banks
certainly within
it's
the powers
business of payments and so forth. I mean, I think that's the sense in which this banking is meant. Now, the actual lending aspect is very tightly. Very specifically
in other areas
controlled by Section 23.
But what I'm saying, what I hear Member Golding saying, which I'm agreeing with, is that you should flow seamlessly from your objects to your functions to then the specific mechanisms, the powers.
There should not be a disconnect between the powers, the functions, and the object. so that there shouldn't be an argument that
I think,
you
Chair,
have these powers, but you shouldn't employ them in this instance because it's not part of the functions to do so.
I think, Chair, if we could take these points and do a little research on, whether that's the right way to express it or if there's a deficiency, because I think we are clear that the statutory basis on which we're to act with respect to those things is what we're addressing through these amendments and what's there already. I think there's a sense that there might be a need for a provision in the objects clause is the issue here that I just need to get a little advice on and look at whether that creates more questions or not and how we solve it, if I may, Chair.
Well, I want to build some capital with my members. So if I say 5:30, then it shall not only be 5:30, it shall be minutes before 5:30. Huh?
We must set the time for the next meeting.
So the date of next meeting is proposed for next Wednesday. What is that? Next Wednesday, the 15th at 2 p.m. Can I have your consent, approval of that? All right, thank you.
Yeah, you have.
Well, 2 more meetings that are programmed already.
Programmed already, which is the 15th and
15th and 22nd, yeah. And with that, I move a motion for adjournment until next Wednesday. All in favor? Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the technical teams, the BOJ, CPC, AG, House of Parliament. Thank you all very much.
There's something about Rosetown that appeals. We've had so many people come and visit and just fall in love. It has a certain appeal because of the whole aesthetics of it.
It has been 3 months right now since I've been working with the Rosetown Foundation. We did a lot in 3 months, like there is a lot we can do here in the Rosetown community.
So what we're doing, we're distributing and dispensing brand new glasses to these children. They're fitted, they're custom made just for them.
The idea is that we want to be able to stimulate an interest, stimulate people to say there is something else you can do, you can get involved, you can achieve.
Once you replace negative thoughts with positive ones, you'll start having positive results. Educate yourself.
It's a new day. Our responsibility to protect our children from harmful TV and radio content.
A and X are no-nos. PG is maybe. G is good to go.
Protect your children and report offensive broadcast content. A message from the Broadcasting Commission.
Make it a new day, yeah.
Welcome everyone to this another language arts lesson. In this lesson, we will be looking at phoneme isolation. This is the first of 2 lessons. Now, let us look at the objectives we hope to achieve at the end of this lesson. At the end of the lesson, students should be able to identify and state beginning, medial, and ending phonemes in words. Match objects with the same beginning or ending sound. Before we go any further, let me remind you what phonemes are. What is a phoneme? A phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in speech. It is the individual sound that a letter makes. Now that you know what a phoneme is, we are now going to be looking at what is phoneme isolation. What is phoneme isolation? Phoneme isolation is the ability to identify where a sound appears in a word or what sound appears in a given position. Now, boys and girls, I'll be showing you a few